Members, welcome to the Joint Select Committee of Adults and Economy Development Select. Obviously, we have invited members of the Planning Committee along this morning as well, so welcome, and I'm absolutely thrilled with the turnout on this Friday morning. On to the agenda. Item 1 is the election of chair. Do we have any nominations, please?
Could I propose Councillor Blakeborough?
Second.
Okay, any other nominations? Okay. Chair, it's your meeting.
Thank you, everybody. And again, thanks for coming today because it is a special. Looking at the agenda, just sort of very quickly then, can we have appointment of Vice Chair?
Can I nominate Paul Pavia, please?
Okay. And seconded. Paul Pavia, that's fabulous. What a surprise. If we go on to apologies for absence.
Yes, Chair. Apologies from Councillors Webb, D. Jones and Roden.
And Bob Greenland.
Okay, thanks.
And any declarations of interest, as and when you're happy, and then fill in the forms afterwards? Okay. So looking at the agenda today, I think we've decided that what we want to try and do is look at the two agenda items in one sweep, so between now and sort of aiming for 1 o'clock at the latest. I'll be leading on the first agenda item, and then Paul will lead on the second agenda item. Before we start, it'd be good just to go around the officers, if the officers can introduce themselves, just for people watching in.
Richard Williams, Democratic Services.
Paula Harris, Scrutiny.
Mark Hand, Head of Planning, Housing and Place Shaping.
Ian Baker, Housing and Communities Manager.
Shirley Wigham, Affordable Housing Officer.
And Ben Winstanley, Estates.
Welcome. Before I start as well, I would also like to just commend people on their commitment in coming to these meetings. Joe Watkins, wedding anniversary today, should be celebrating a romantic dinner, but instead here representing our residents, so well done. Men, take note of this, take note. Okay, so going on to the first agenda item then. This is reviewing affordable housing, our approach to affordable housing. So the purpose of this session is to have a discussion in order to look at the input to the Welsh Government's call for evidence on affordable housing delivery. Welsh Government are looking at 20,000 affordable housing in their time in office. At the end of December 2021, Monmouthshire will be short of 337. So Shirley Wigham, I've seen your response from Welsh Government, many questions to be answered. And as I say, I think it was blood, sweat and tears, I think, answering all those questions from Shirley. And I guess what we want to do today is to review Shirley's report, and if there's anything else we can add to that report to go forward to the Welsh Government's review. So if I could just go towards Shirley just as a brief introduction.
Sorry, thanks, Councillor Baker. I'll just cover a quick intro. What we propose to do is, rather than go through each of the questions in turn, is just go through a couple of slides to set a bit of context about where we are with affordable housing, what our current policies are. I'll put up a slide that shows what the questions are, and then I was hoping that a conversation about affordable housing will naturally flow, knowing the cross-party strength of feeling for affordable housing. I don't think I've got any concerns that will happen. So we can go through the proposed response in detail as needed, but really I was looking just for your thoughts to flow out as we're going. Although the primary focus is on the Welsh Government's current call for evidence, I think we'll also take note of what you're saying, because potentially it will shape our future policies in the next LDP, albeit we're at early stages of that. So the two topics, as Councillor Blakeburgh mentioned, the first is around that call for evidence on affordable housing, and then the second, which we'll come to separately later, but it is related, which is how we're dealing with unallocated housing sites and our housing land shortfall between now and the next LDP. So the first topic, bear with me. So as a bit of context, I'll talk through our current policy, what we're currently achieving, and current needs, with some input on any detail from Shirley and Ian if members need it. And then we'll move on to the discussion. So in terms of current policy, I'm sure you could all recite this in your sleep, but essentially in the LDP now, it's 25% of development sites in the south of the county should be affordable, 35% elsewhere, with the exception of the main village sites where we have these 60-40 sites, as we call them. So they're small, between 5 and 15 dwellings, allocated sites in the LDP in the main villages. So places like Pormeric's got one, and Dingestow. And 60% of those sites are affordable. Not those sites, but the other sites within the LDP, those figures, the 25%, the 35%, they are subject to viability appraisal, which no doubt there will be some discussion about, but that is a natural part of the process, and the system isn't bespoke to a Monmouthshire by any extent. Our policy position at the moment requires all affordable housing to be neutral tenure. And that means all of it has to be up to design quality requirements, DQR standards, and it means the developer gets 42% of acceptable cost guidance, ACG. That latter one is a figure that the Welsh Government sets. There's different bands across Wales, so they'll have a table that says a 3-bed semi in Monmouthshire, which is either band 4 or 5, is worth X. So a developer will get 42% of X when they're building. So that's how that funding happens. Providing affordable housing is effectively a cost to a developer. And we'll come on to it again later, talking about different ways of getting affordable housing. But the main way that we get affordable housing is via the PLCs. The private sector builds houses, a proportion of which is affordable. And while there's some flaws in that process and system, that is the biggest contributor we have. So I think one of the things we'll talk about later is other ways of securing affordable housing as well. But those PLCs, they will always have a role to play, and an important role to play in getting us some housing. In terms of how we're progressing and performing so far, so since the LDP was adopted in 2014, the middle column shows you completions, and then the right-hand column shows permissions. So there are two separate things going on. The 17 completions in 2014-15, they'll be from older sites, from the old plan, as they come forward. And then with time, those LDP sites will be coming forward as well. So since plan adoption up till the end of March 2018, we've had 211 affordable houses completed, and we've given consent for another 542. So the numbers are going in the right direction, but they are below where we'd want them to be. The LDP sets a target of 96 per annum, so that 211 figure should be 384 if we're looking at that target. In terms of needs, these are probably the most important figures. So the Common Housing Register that Shirley produces from evidence, we've got 2,073 households in bands 1 to 4. And there's a bit of a breakdown there on the age profile of those people. The second age profile is a very significant age range, hence it's such a big number. But there's 321 under 25s on there. And that's relevant in particular to the other conversation we're having about our demography and our lack of 20 to 40-year-olds. So this is how that all stitches together. But also we've got the ageing population profile, so over 65s and over 85s. The proportion of those in Monmouthshire is increasing well above the Wales average. And we have a fair number within those age brackets that are also in need of affordable housing. So perhaps somewhat surprisingly, 189 people over the age of 65 are on our housing register. We'll circulate this after the meeting so you can see all the data in more clarity. But the table down below, you possibly can't see from where you're sitting, but that gives an idea of the wage profile of people on the Common Housing Register. So 14.5% of people on the register earn under £10,000 a year. 18%, this column, this row towards the bottom of the table, earn between 25,000 and 35,000. And realistically, it's at that level people on the register can afford low-cost home ownership because of the cost ratios on there. So we'll talk about that a bit later if members have questions and need clarification. But our primary needs is on social rented because everyone below that can't get onto the LCHO level. The figures on the right are very recent figures from our emerging local housing market assessment that Shirley's been working on. This gives us the figures for the next 5 years. Shirley, I don't know if you want to talk through these figures in a bit more detail. Yeah, Councillor Petrini, do you want to ask a question and we'll come through these?
Just a clarifying question. On the salary earnings table, does that include people's income from other things other than work? So benefits, or is that just people working?
It's just the salaries they've declared. They don't always fill in the benefit.
Can't hear you.
Sorry, Shirley, can you use your mic?
It's just the salary wages that they've declared on the application form.
And that is that application form explicitly say working?
Yeah. No, there's a column for your salary or your wage if you are working. They don't. There is a column for benefits, but they quite often don't fill that in.
Right.
So it's not a complete-
So are you saying to me that you think you're not getting an accurate picture from our own people on the register?
I don't look at the benefits part of it because they don't put that down.
Sorry, I was just trying to see that percentages in relation to the people who might not be.
Mm-hmm.
That could be just the working population. Do you know what I mean? I was just trying to get in my
Yeah.
head. Sorry.
Yeah,
Yeah.
so they're the ones that are declaring a wage on the application form. So people that are not working will have left that blank.
So to clarify that then, Councillor Petrini, by raising that, you're saying that the picture is bleaker than what we see there, yeah?
Members, if it helps, the line you probably can't see at the bottom from where you're sat, apologies for that, is no earnings declared, and that's just under 35%. Yeah, I can't see that from yeah, sorry. We'll circulate this after. So, well, 34.7%. So yeah. So either they've chosen not to tell us, or it's because they're not earning. They're seeking benefits. Shirley, did you want to provide any detail on the bit on the right with the LHMA?
Now, I've just completed the local housing market assessment using the Welsh Government's methodology. And the social housing need figure, I would say, is very accurate, and that's per year for the next 5 years. The LCHO figure is much more difficult because the way that the methodology is, you look at everybody in Monmouthshire and you use khaki paycheck to look at their earnings and see whether they could only afford social rent, whether they could afford an intermediate rent, whether they can do LCHO, or whether they can satisfy their own need in the open market. This 273 are the people from the whole of Monmouthshire that look like they would need an LCHO product. But I really need to stress 273 households won't be coming and putting their name on our register, requiring our help, because they will use other means. They'll use Bank of Mum and Dad, stay at home to save. They'll go and live somewhere a bit cheaper. We have evidence that people from Abergavenny, for example, go up to Bryn Mawr, Bronafon. People from the south will buy a house in Newport because they're much cheaper, certainly to get a foothold on the ladder. So that figure and the intermediate rent figure are arrived at with the same methodology. So we can't say that those people will all come and ask us for our help, but some of them will. But we've no way of knowing how many using this methodology. Sorry, low-cost home ownership.
Okay, thanks. So we can come back to any queries around that as the discussion progresses. The other thing that I just want to take you through briefly is an idea of what other people are doing. So there's quite a lot of headlines at the moment about delivery of affordable housing in England. Some good headline snippets, arguably, but if you drill down into some of the data, it's arguably not so good. So one of the things that's come up in England over recent years is this second line, which is something called affordable rent. So because we have neutral tenure here, we're looking at products being a social rented value, which we can explain in a minute. One of the biggest products that's come about in England recently is what they call affordable rent, which is effectively 80% of market rent. This isn't very clear anyway, but if you look at the figures, social rent in 2008, 2009, they were delivering in England 30,800 units in that year. It's now down to about 5,300. Because that balance has been flipped by what used to be zero affordable rent, because that didn't used to exist, up to 24,350 affordable rented units. So there are different approaches out there that we could take in theory, but what we wanted to flag up around some of those, this table at the bottom, again, you're not going to be able to see the detail, apologies, but this sets out the average weekly market rent for different size properties. A figure of 80% of that rent, which is what affordable rent under an English policy would be, versus the fourth column, which is the local housing allowance. So if you're on benefits, that's how much you get, versus social rent, which is what our policy looks at. So for a one-bedroom property, social rent that we charge is £84 per week. You would get a maximum of £90.90 benefits if you're on benefits, so that's affordable. If you were doing 80% market rent in Monmouthshire, it would be £103 a week. So as an occupier of a property or someone on our housing need register, you'd have to somehow find £13 a week to make up the difference. So we could have, well, I guess what I'm trying to say is we could do different things, have a really good headline, so we delivered loads, 80% affordable rent, but it isn't genuinely affordable to those people on benefits. So we need to be mindful of how that works. Similar story with a 3-bed. You would get £133.85 per week in benefits compared to £152 if it were a rent set at 80% of market value. Yeah, of course, yeah.
Can I just say it's not that it's not affordable to people on benefits, it's not affordable to people on low wages as well. That's a problem we had when we tried some intermediate rent. We did some in Abergavenny, and the situation we were in was we had these lovely new houses. If you were on benefit, you could have them because your benefit would cover it, but if you were on a low wage, you couldn't afford it. So that's not really a message we want to send to people.
So one last slide really from me, which just sets out the questions, and then we'll pass over to you for discussion. We can go through the questions in turn if you'd like, but I think probably a discussion will naturally flow. Ian's kindly agreed to jot down on the board any key points that we need to capture to make sure we feed them into the answers. Probably that'll mean we have to unjumble what you've said and stick it into one of 9 categories, but that's fine. So the questions they're looking at are understanding housing needs. So it's around the actual data. Again, if you want clarification on that from the paper, we can talk through that. Grant intervention, how that works, and rent policy. Number 4 is standards and DQR. So I popped up this picture just to show. There's an argument you could have that our policy of having neutral tenure, which forces everything to be DQR compliant, makes it more expensive to build because it's a higher standard property. So if we dropped that standard, then theoretically we could get a bit more affordable housing. But the question is more of what. So that picture there I throw up every now and again just to stir people up a bit. This is a PLC's 2-bedroom property that was being built on a site in Abergavenny. So it's 50 square metres. Get Councillor Edwards excited. Now, not a cupboard in sight. Even your understairs cupboard is your downstairs loo. So it is particularly small, well below what a DQR standard would be. So we could have that kind of thing done in some other way as affordable. But do we want that kind of thing? Or do we want DQR? I think it is a discussion that we need to have. But my preference would certainly be DQR. Something of quality that is long living. and suitable for people longer term rather than potentially a quick fix. So I put that in there just to stir that up slightly. Number 5 looks at local authority building. So there are discussions around different ways of delivering housing, full stop. So as the discussion progresses, I'll call on Pete or Deb or Ben to talk through some of those points if you're happy doing that. But again, slightly provocatively, I'll stick this in. This is a graph showing affordable housing delivery or public sector house building as well. Since the 70s, you can see it's massively declined. That's no great surprise to you. But as a slight, I guess, nudge to our consciences, I mean, we can all look back with rose-tinted glasses about how amazing the 60s and 70s were and how much we built, but some of it looked like that bottom right-hand corner. So it wasn't all an amazing success. And some of it also tried some innovative methods of construction, and bits of the building fell off because they weren't done properly. So again, I don't mean that overly flippantly, but just a bit of a sanity check almost, that it's about more than just numbers. So back in the size picture before and kind of tower blocks, I mean, that isn't going to fit in Monmouthshire anyway. That's clearly from London or Croydon or somewhere. But just as that kind of sanity check. Topic 7's around modern methods of construction. And again, a slight nudge, we need to think about what would agree there. 7 is public sector land. We're already doing quite a lot in that regard with our own land within the LDP. There's current application in for Crick Road, which, as you'll be aware, we're looking at doing a venture with Mellin Homes to deliver that. But yeah, to what extent could we do more in that regard, or is there stuff we should do differently? The capacity of RSLs, Shirley's gathered some data from the RSLs themselves, but really that's one for them to answer, probably more than us. And then use of existing powers. So those are the headlines of the questions. I was happy, Chair, just to pass over to members, and we'll take the discussion as it comes, answer any questions as they come, and go from there.
We've all had the report looking at the answers from Shirley, which I found very interesting. And I think if we could look at that as a guide, I think. So over to Jane. Jane, you've got a question.
Sorry, could I just say that for those of us that aren't on planning and aren't really au fait with this, could you explain these abbreviations that you're using as you go through? I mean, I've worked out what it is, but it would be helpful.
Yeah, sorry, Chair, I've tried to do that as going, but yeah, if there's any that I've missed, then by all means do. Probably the one I didn't mention was RSL's capacity of those, so that's registered social landlords. So for us, Monmouthshire Housing Association, which we'll call MHA, Mellin Homes and Pobble are the 3 that operate within Monmouthshire. So yeah, but apologies, it's very easy with planning and all areas of local government to slip into little abbreviations. So if you've got lost by us, then bring me back to reality.
The only thing I would say is a general point. I've been in some depressing meetings, but this is one of the most depressing, I think, in looking at some of those figures. And it's certainly not, in a sense, Mark's fault. But undoubtedly, and I'm not an expert on housing, I'm not on planning, but I do think, having listened to this just for the first 10 minutes, we really need to start getting our act together and actually doing something to start to ameliorate it, to actually do something, because for those people stuck in poor housing or in bed and breakfast or whatever, it's okay looking at the bureaucratic side, but the reality is their life is pretty awful. And it's going to affect them, and it's going to affect their children in the future. And we're only building up problems for ourselves in the future in terms of people not doing well. So I really think we need to put our heads together and actually do something now, and to see more social housing being built, and not looking at the depressing figures from 2013, 2014. So it's just a general point.
Thank you, Chairman. Following on from what Jude was just saying, what is sad to see is the amount that we've given planning permission for to be built and haven't been built. And this goes back to the developers. Sorry, and the other point I want to make, the Persimmon development in Foist, there have been posters outside those because there is no room to put anything, clothes, belongings or anything, saying don't buy these. And I don't know how long they stayed up for before somebody made them take them down. But just because you're not very well off doesn't mean to say you haven't got clothes and belongings. And if you've got children, you've got even more. And I think as long as they're allowed to build houses without either rooms for cupboards or built-in cupboards, we're not doing them a favour. And I think this, that must be looked into. But also, how can we get the developers, once they've got planning permission, to get and build them?
Chair, do you want me? Yeah, do you want me to come back on a couple of those points? Because they are really good ones. In terms of the figures of what's been approved but isn't yet built, most of that, I'd say all of that actually, is more of a natural time lag in things coming through. Although you hear some headlines about developers land banking, that kind of stuff, when you look at the tables we put forward before council in other reports, our sites are coming forward. Our issue is they're coming forward more slowly than we wanted them to. People will build in Monmouthshire. The market is there. People will certainly build here. And the affordable housing that's approved will happen. The RSLs are doing their bits. So with that 542, there's a time lag behind that of when we're going to see that coming through. But I am confident they will happen. There's not many sites I can think of where they are stalling. There's some challenges around a couple of the 60-40 sites that have got permission, but those numbers are relatively small. So I genuinely don't believe we have a land banking issue in Monmouthshire with developers just sat on land thinking I've got my consent, I'm not going to do anything. It's a case of getting those permissions through and as quickly as possible and those schemes going. In terms of what's being built, both market and affordable, I'll go back to that provocation. Again, we have had a debate with members, but also as officers. In terms of market housing, more than affordable, which is worse? The sites, the developer that built that, who's been mentioned, they also had another site in Abergavenny, and we got these taken out because we didn't want them. And they agreed to. They've actually found the market isn't quite there in places like Monmouthshire. It's more of an urban type market for those smaller units. But we did have the debate, and it is one that's worth having. These were going for about 145,000. The next size up 2-bed that had cupboards and room to swing a cat was about 174. So which is worse? Again, just a bit of a provocation to get you thinking. Is it better to have these and get some people who don't qualify for affordable housing on the market? Or is it better to have the more expensive house and those people just wait? And that is a genuine question. I'm not quite sure what the right answer is. In terms of do we tackle that and how do we tackle that, a discussion started about what we do in the next LDP. There are standards in England that look at minimum sizes for market dwellings. There's one standard being produced and it's up to councils whether or not they adopt it. So there's a discussion started about, as officers, is that something we should do in the next LDP? And we've started discussions with 4 of the big house builders to see what that would do to what they're building on our sites at the moment. How much would be acceptable, how much wouldn't. That's probably a topic for another seminar altogether, but it is something that we can look at.
Yes, thank you, Chair. I've looked at the response, and in some senses, I'm sure it's fine, but some of it is, fairly technical and has quite a particular knowledge within this area, like, for example, repairs allowance and dowry and a lot of shorthand phrases. So I'm not quite sure I fully understand the response we're giving, but I'm sure it's probably fine. The other thing is that there doesn't seem to be at this consultation any other comments. Do you have any other comments? Because I certainly would be in favour of standards in terms of sizes, and I think the point that Councillor Powell was making in relation to not having cupboards in some properties, I mean, we do want to maintain the size standards in affordable housing, but we also want to maintain the size standards of market housing as well, because, if you don't have those, then, literally some of these places, the old phrase, you couldn't swing, nobody wants to swing a cat, but you couldn't swing a cat in them. And they also have sort of almost doll-like furniture in them to make them look somewhat bigger than they really are, you know. So we have to think about the standards, you know, not only for affordable but for market housing as well. In terms of planning, some of the things that I don't like seeing is when developers who, you know, obviously make a substantial profit on buildings end up coming out with viability assessments that say either they can't build on-site affordable housing, and I think affordable housing needs to be on-site because it needs to be where it's locally based, and the other thing is that they're going to make a very minimal contribution to affordable housing. I'm thinking particularly recently of the McCarthy one, where there was a very small contribution, and it was supported by the district valuer in relation to viability. But I think, you know, we all ought to have sort of high standards of insisting that affordable housing is where we need it and not built elsewhere, and also that it's on-site rather than off-site, and a preference for having that, and also to make sure that if it is off-site, you know, that we get a proper contribution to it. The other thing is I've seen developments whereby, you know, it said somehow they can fit in private housing on that site, but affordable housing would be difficult to fit in, you know, in view of the size and so forth. Now, I find it a little bit odd that you can get private housing squeezed in, but you can't manage to get affordable housing. So I think we've got to be careful about the standards that we're actually setting, and look at these particular issues as much as we can, and you know, make sure that we do get a proper contribution in relation to affordable housing. The other thing is I think that we ought to look at more sort of innovative approaches to this particular problem. I was looking on some sites that were mentioning about innovation in other local authorities, and there is one of these sites, I think it's in the London area, that it's run by a private organisation, but it's called Share and Care. And basically what it does is it matches elderly residents who are based in larger properties with younger people needing accommodation. It does proper DBS checks, and it also tries to match their needs in terms of interests, you know, gardening or music or whatever. And they basically they don't pay much of a rent, or basically just pay a monthly contribution, each of them, to the agencies that has set this up, a private agency. And, you know, effectively they are DBS checked and everything else, and they pay for their own food, but they don't necessarily pay a rent, because they do that in exchange for providing a contract in terms of so many hours of company and so forth. Now, I think those sort of solutions are one that help with our loneliness problem in Monmouthshire. You know, the fact that we've got people in larger accommodation than they necessarily need, but also that they, you know, have support needs as well. So I think we need to start looking at more innovative solutions. Thank you.
Thanks, Louise. I think there's a lot of useful sort of insights and observations there. Ian wants to come back on that, but just to say, Roger will be next, and then Jane.
Just two comments. The first, in relation to dowries and whatnot, MRAs, we did give Monmouthshire Housing the opportunity to feed into that. So the content of that essentially is at the back relates to MHA, so we just felt it was useful to give them the opportunity to feed into this, but obviously coming from us, so as an opportunity to support them. But in relation to your comment about the was it Share and Care model that you're aware of, as we speak, we're actually recruiting for a supported lodgings coordinator. We're working in partnership with Ciommittee in that respect, and we're developing a pilot scheme under our Supporting People banner to promote lodgings and that dimension will be part of this scheme. It's going to go a bit wider, targeting young homeless people as well. But we're developing this lodgings model. Ciommittee are going to have a part-time coordinator, and we're going to have a part-time coordinator, and we're going to do it on a pilot basis for, say, about a year, and see how we go for that. So.
Thank you, Chair. We must recognise that we're in the hands here of 4 or 5 national builders, and to a certain extent, Louise has stolen my my thunder. That previous slide showed, I think it's Persimmon House, a company that's made over £500 million profit this year, paying its chief executive, I think it's 50 odd million. I can't think of anything more obscene than that. And when they come along and tell us that their sites aren't viable and they can't build any affordable houses because backed up by the district valuer, that is just not good enough, and we need to do something about that. Again, on the McCarthy and Stone, the district valuer said, no way will this development allow McCarthy and Stone to cough up 730,000. Well, I'm going to reduce it to 230,000. He didn't take into account that McCarthy and Stone are the sort of developers that carry on owning that property and get revenue from that property all the time it is there. That wasn't taken into account. So we lost £500,000 of affordable housing, Section 106 money. And to my mind, that is, it's part of the huge reason that we're in the mess that we are. We need this viability problems to be sorted out, and we're talking about private builders here. It's a bit of a problem. I think the only way that it can be sorted is for us as a nation to start crying foul in a big way. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you very much, Chair. It seems to me that we've got 2 issues here: people who need homes to rent and people who may be able to buy a home but can't afford to buy a home because they're so expensive. And I think we've got to start thinking outside the box. And I don't sit on planning, but I dealt with a planning application on the Community Council yesterday, which was change of use in Gilwan from a hairdresser's to a family home. And it's a family that want to do this because they are desperate and they cannot afford the homes that are being built in places like the Alders in Gilwan. So we've got a terrible problem that our young people cannot afford to stay where they want to stay, where they have obviously support from families. That's where their home has always been, and they're being forced out because of the prices. So I think we need to look also at the properties that we've got. And I'm old enough to remember in the 70s in London, a lot of my friends, when I was in my early 20s, bought refurbished properties. They were large old terraced houses that, they converted. And what's the attitude of these housing associations to actually, we've got a massive property in Gilwan, the old Navigation pub. And I mean, it's highly unlikely that that's going to stay as a pub. Have they able to refurbish a property like that and turn it into flats for, a lot of people are living on their own now. The sort of accommodation we need is very different to years ago. It's not just, it is family homes, but a lot of people are living alone too. So what's the attitude towards looking at these empty places, and with a footfall in the high street down by 20%, and empty shops that are coming available, we are going to have to change our attitudes, and it's going to be a completely different mix in the future in the high street. And I want to know what opportunities there's going to be for us there to make the most of these properties.
Thanks,
Can I just add one quick thing? I would also like to just add, we had that meeting with Tony from CARE, and I think we're storing up massive problems for ourselves by allowing these developers to build these tiny homes where we don't know what people's needs are going to be in the future. We're all living a lot longer. A lot of us will become disabled, and you can't live in these places if you've got any needs like that. So I think that's another issue that needs to be taken into account. Thank you, Chair.
Thanks for including that, Jane. Does anybody want to come back on that?
Yeah, Chair. Could I think Shirley and I both come back on that? In terms of, if I do them in reverse, in terms of the question about shops and the future of the high street, that kind of stuff, that's something that we need to look at in the next LDP. I think the first question we need to ask is, are all aspects of that high street beyond saving? So before we kind of throw in the towel almost and say that shopping's completely dead, we just need to make sure we're doing everything we can to support businesses where we can. But there are, within the LDP, we define core retail areas where policies are really restrictive in terms of doing anything apart from retail uses. So we need to look at those again. You know, are those areas too big? Do we need to shrink those areas to reflect the way shopping has changed? It has changed. It's changed very quickly. We partly need to be careful we don't make too many knee-jerk reactions because it's happened so quickly. We're not quite sure where it might go in the next 10 to 15 years. You know, it's only 10 years ago people were building massive supermarkets. And the Tesco's in Newport's the second biggest in the UK. That was the thing to do 10 years ago. Less than 10 years ago, in fact. All of a sudden, it's absolutely not the way people are shopping. So we need to be mindful of that. The way it seems to be going is that it's more like a retail experience. So people are going for meals out, experiencing something rather than coming away with a bag with something in it. So we need to respond to that as well with our policies. And some of that might mean it's freed up for residential uses on the edges of town centres. And that in itself can help support the town centre. So that's all stuff we need to look at through the next LDP. But you're right in those concepts. Conversions, probably the main issue is around the cost of doing it and whether you can make a converted property compliant with these design quality requirements. Because it is harder when you're doing a conversion of an old building than just starting afresh. But it can be done. Pobble in Newport is producing about 200 apartments in the city centre above shops. It was part funded by 14 point something million pounds worth of Welsh Government funded under the Vibrant Viable Places scheme to physically help fund the conversion works. So it can be done. That was significantly supported financially by the Welsh Government, so whether or not it stacks up on its own is debatable. But yeah, I think in principle it can happen. Shirley, you got more detail to feed into that?
Yeah, just to add to that, we did speak to the housing associations because we had some vibrant and viable loan funding for Abergavenny, and we did approach the housing associations about the possibility of looking at units above shops. Far more complex than I'd appreciated because it started interfering with their own loan finance. But I think one of the things that did come out quite loud and clear that the massive challenges involved with tackling properties above shops. Remote landlords, shared access, the cost of fire improvements, shared services. So I mean, I completely agree with you. I think there's some real opportunities there, and it'd be fantastic to actually bring some of those units back into residential use. But it's far more complicated than it looks. But we'd always keep our eye open for any opportunity.
I have to sort of not declare an interest, but my stepson has just bought an old bank in Lancashire, and he's converting it, the first floor into a restaurant pub, the next floor into 3 apartments, and the top floor he's making a penthouse. It seems to me that we come up with all these excuses why we can't do it, and there's all these people that haven't got homes to live in, and actually the private sector are going ahead and converting these buildings. It seems that they can do it, but we can't, and the private sector then will obviously charge premium prices for these properties. So I think we've got to stop making excuses, and I think Welsh Government have really got to look at this problem and make the most of what we've got. So I accept what you say, but it seems to me the private sector can convert these buildings and we can't. Thank you.
A good and interesting point there. I've got Councillor Crowcutt and then Councillor Edwards. I have got everybody in the list there. I've got you down there as well, yeah. Okay.
Thank you, Chair. I'd like to just make a couple of points about the issue that Mark raised about the quality of build of properties and how lowering the standards would enable us to build more. I would hope that we would reject that out of hand. And just a couple of points to reinforce why I say that. When I was born, the first 5 years of my life, in common with, I guess, probably many people here, I lived in a brand new 3-bedroom council house that was built in those immediate post-war years to really a very high standard. And I lived there with my parents until they could afford to get a place of their own. And I think many of us come as a result of the high social expectations that living in houses like that were able to generate. Having moved from a lower quality house to what was really a very pleasant house in which I can well remember my early years, really gave my parents and indeed myself a very high expectation of what I could go on to expect in the community that I lived in. And I would like to see us maintain that same belief as a council, that we can help people to get a really positive start in life and a view of what they can achieve in life. And the other point I would make is that I joined the Labour Party in the mid-1970s and at that point was living in Newcastle on Tyne. And members will remember the scandal around the leader of the council at that time, T. Dan Smith, and John Poulson, both of whom were sent to prison over issues around housing. And when T. Dan Smith was released from prison, he reapplied to the Labour Party, and I was part of a small panel that looked into his application. And so I was able to see a fair bit about the background of that Smith and Poulson scandal. And part of it was around really quite a desire by the City Council at that point to house as many people as they could. And started off by going down the route of, well, we can build them cheap and we can stack them in. And I think from that then came the pressure of developers like Poulson on the council to say, well, let's build more and more and more. And you know, I'm not suggesting that anybody here would have gone down the same route and saying, well, give me a huge brown envelope stuffed full of pound notes and I'll support that. But nonetheless, the pressures were there. Once you start going in cahoots with people who can say, yeah, we can help you and we can build at a lower quality, then I think you're on a slippery slope. So 2 points there to urge this authority to say people have a right to decent houses and that is part of giving people expectations that they can be successful in their lives.
Thanks for that. I mean, at the end, I'll be summarising, but there's definitely a strong theme coming through here around quality. I think many members have mentioned it. Ruth Edwards.
Thank you, Chair. I think Jane has stolen quite a bit of my thunder because the officers will appreciate I've been on planning now 14 years and I keep going on about the housing need. We'll never make more land. Developers always want to have bare land because it's much more cost effective for them to build. We've always had this issue with empty homes across the county, where I think perhaps more help could be done to enable perhaps the owners to do something with grants so that they can be brought back into use. And we've only just got to look down the road. The big bank on the square is empty. Now it's going to be a private home. The high street, as we all know, is changing completely, not just with banking, but all sorts of shopping. And when I've said years ago now about the shops that are closing, we get a lot of charity shops on the high street, what happens to above, and then, gosh, okay. We've always had this issue now of, as Jane says, the excuses because of different ownership of flats or what's in the shop downstairs about security and the services. But surely there are some of these big developers that can buy the whole building and convert it. And there's a lot of people, especially on low income or whatever, and when they're elderly, they're not driving, they need to live in a built-up area where they can still be included in society and community and feel safer in the town with their services of doctors or whatever. And these properties would be a great benefit to that, because once they go and live out in the countryside, with my farmer's hat on now, it's lovely when they come out there, they've got space, then all of a sudden there's no rural transport, their needs change greatly. And then where do they go and look for housing? And it's such a complex thing. And if you've got young families who start with 1 or 2 children in a 2-3 bedroomed house, and you've got no proper accommodation in there, as we said about what they provide in far as cupboards and storage, and very little outside space, you come into the thing of mental issues then, of how frustrating it is. And everybody is fully aware of the mental issue on people today. So standards of a house that you're going to live in should accommodate so that you can live in there comfortably without being sort of squashed in, stacking stuff in corners and stopping. It's the quality of your life that you want as well. And I think with the commencement usually being for any sort of building within 5 years, I think that is too long a time. I think it should be start commencement in 3 years, because as we're going now through another review, we're still playing catch up all the time with our housing. And I'm sure that a lot of people, if you wanted to get a house built somewhere, get your planning permission, and do you really want to be thinking, oh, I'll do it in 5 years' time, because really you want to build a house. So I think this business of commencement in 5 years is far too long, and I think perhaps we ought to be able to look at when we should complete as well, because some of it can go on for years, and it sort of skews our figures a great deal. And I think really the town centres and all that are altering, online shopping, out-of-town shopping, what are we doing to keep our high streets alive? So there's a lot of things in there that I think we can address, because everybody knows Monmouthshire is a lovely county to live in.
Thanks for that, Ruth. It's brilliant having your comments, because obviously Ruth is chair of planning. You've got years and years of experience there. A wise woman. If I can pass over to Mark, I think Mark wants to come back on that.
Yeah, loads of great points there, Chair, thanks. But yeah, just the one point, in terms of the time period to commence the 5 years, yeah, legislation allows us to set a shorter period if we want to, or even a longer period. So certainly on the sites where they're trying to address our 5-year housing land supply shortfall, which we'll talk about later, we are giving them a much shorter period of time. So we can do that more widespread. The one thing we can't do, though, unfortunately, is require completion. There's something in planning legislation called a completion notice, but what it doesn't do is require something to be completed. If we serve a completion notice on you, you either have to finish it or your permission lapses in its entirety. And normally the ones that have stagnated, you just end up with a consent that lapses, and then you've got a half-finished building and no permission to even finish it anymore. So it doesn't actually do what it says on the tin. So we're a bit stuck in that regard. Although again, I can't think of a massive number of, or even any off the top of my head of schemes in Monmouthshire that have started and not finished. We've got one I can think of that's going far slower than we would like it to, in Chepstow. But yeah, I'm struggling to think of any that are completely stalled. But certainly the commencement we can have a look at. The other topics raised are largely for the next LDP, I think.
Just so that people are aware, we've got Ben and Debbie have come forward, and I think you're here to also contribute to sort of the discussion around affordable housing, just in case people are wondering why suddenly you're here. But you're welcome.
Chair, sorry, one of the angles that we started touching on, but not quite, is the extent to which we're reliant on the PLCs and what they can deliver. I think, as I mentioned at the start, they'll always have an important role to play, but we need to put eggs in different baskets, and there are different things that are happening. So the registered social landlords, the RSLs that we operate with, each of those now has a private building arm. So, for example, MHA is, I've forgotten what theirs is called now. Oh, Capsule, theirs is called. And Mellon's got something similar. They've just changed the name of Candleston or something. So they're doing things in different ways, and we benefit from that because their profit margins are lower. So we end up with a greater affordable housing allowance. But then there's other options as well that have been talked about through council meetings, and different ways we as a landowner can operate. So that's why I've asked Deb and Ben if they could pop down and answer some of those points or clarify those. But I don't know, Chair, do you want Deb and Ben to speak now, or do you want to take more questions and see how the conversation develops?
Yeah, thank you, Chair. My point goes right back to Tudor's point at the beginning, the point that hasn't come forward with regards to delays in getting these houses built is in fact the infrastructure throughout the county. We've got sites held up because the builders want to build, they're ready to build, but until Welsh Water provide the facilities to enable them to build there, they can't progress. Welsh Water have got an entirely different timescale that they're thinking of to everybody else. So we can often be frustrated by the fact that we've given the planning permission, the builders want to build, but they can't build because there's nothing for them to connect to.
Thanks for that. Jo?
Thank you. So the point I'd like to raise, and you have mentioned it previously, is that we are losing our younger people from the county, the people in their 20s and their 30s who want to buy a home, because that is what most of us want to do. Most of us want to own our own home. And we actually have a Welsh Government scheme at the moment, which is part of the Liberal Democrat Progressive Agreement with the Welsh Government. No. Of a rent to own. I will get it in. It's a great rent to own scheme. It's really, really good. And we don't have anything of that sort within Monmouthshire. And I think, why are we not actually making use of something that the Welsh Government has already put into place in order to try and keep some of our younger people within the county? I regularly talk to people who have their 20-year-old children and they're moving to Newport because they cannot possibly get on the housing ladder even in Caldicot anymore. Caldicott's rents and prices are going through the roof at the moment with the Severn Bridge tolls coming down. So if we don't do something to try and address the fact that our young people will never be able to become first-time buyers, then we will have an ever-increasing population, ageing population, and we really do need to bring something in to try and let young people buy their own homes in Monmouthshire.
Thanks for that, Jo. And yeah. Can I just ask one question, Jez? Do you mind? Because I know Councillor Petruni, you have to leave very soon. So on the next, do you mind?
I am going to witter for a while, so you can do yours first.
So appreciate your honesty.
It's just to say it once Shirley is fed back. If you're next, yeah. Sorry, thanks, Shirley.
Just about the rent to own, we have been given an allocation in Monmouthshire. All counties have been given an allocation to do rent to own. The problem is it's not an affordable scheme. It's based on market rent, and the RSL has to be able to do a deal with the developer to get the home for less than market value to be able to do it. Developers are selling it off plan now, and there's no way they're going to sell to an RSL. So the only way that it could possibly work, I think, in Monmouthshire is when an RSL has a site that they're developing themselves. So I have asked Mellon if they would consider doing it in a site that they're looking at in Abergavenny.
Chair, could I? Oh, go on. I was going to mention on a related note, it is something we can look at with the next LDP in terms of the balance, I guess, of affordable housing. So although we've stressed neutral tenure, if we're talking about people in their 20s, 30s wanting to buy a home, then one argument is we could have a policy that says, just assume it's still 25% affordable housing in the south of the county, that 10% is LCHO, low cost home ownership, and the other 15% is social rented or neutral tenure. That's something we could consider if you think that's addressing a part of the housing market that we're missing at the moment. So just throw that out there. Go on, Shirley. Are you going to tell me that we can't do that? No, okay.
All I would like to say is that if we do that, the developers will try to get us to accept their product as the LCHO, and I would say please don't do that, because you're going to end up with that very small house. And if someone buys, a young family buys on LCHO, it's quite often that they cannot make that step to full market value for quite a long time. So if they have a 2-bedroom, for example, if they buy a developer's 2-bedroom, it'll be one decent bedroom and a very, very small bedroom. A DQR has 2 double bedrooms. That allows their family to grow a little, and they're not going to be struggling to live in that property, because they will have to live in it for quite a long time to be able to take that next step up on the...
Thank you, Councillor Becker, once again. I'll quickly talk to the report, and then I'll just briefly talk about the wider issues. 6B, modern methods construction. I won't talk too much because I suspect Councillor Becker is going to talk about that in greater detail. But we haven't answered it, and I'm just wondering why not. And I'll say no more than that, except that Bristol are really leading the way on some of the modern construction stuff, and their housing market is completely overheated. So the council there, I really think of innovative ways. So I'm just wondering why, and I know Councillor Beck will talk more about that, so I will stop. 7, I was going to talk about public use of public lands, but I think you know where I'm going to go with that, and I'll mention that a bit later. 9A, legislative powers. We haven't answered that. We haven't answered what existing powers. Is that because we think there are no current existing powers that could be improved, which will enable us to better deliver the housing we need? Is that the non-response? Is that what it means? Or I would appreciate clarification on that. It'd be really great. You know what I sort of think we know the problem. We've known the problem for 6 years, longer maybe. We've known this, about how young people, and some of this conversation frustrates me because we're talking about tweaking, regulatory tweaking, and it's not going to work. It hasn't worked, and it won't work in the future. We just keep on doing the same old stuff. It's same with social justice, same old stuff, hoping someday the same old policies will suddenly work. They're not going to. The market is there to make money. It's simple as that. And we trying to fight against that is a nonsense. So I have said for ages, and if you come up with a better idea, I'll be the first to say that's a way better idea. And why I'm glad to see Ben and co with us is we've got to do our own company. We have to do our own company. We have to drive it ourselves. That is the only way we're going to deliver it, or anywhere near what we need. I appreciate the strategic discussion in the document. I presume when you say strategic, you're talking about the need for a new town. I don't know if that's what you mean about strategic use of land, but I think that is ultimately where we are. To talk about the Welsh Government and money, and even us, if we develop our own company, about money, we won't be able to compete with the market. And we talk about the heyday of the post-war years. I think Councillor Grocott talked about it. That was built, all those houses were built by US borrowed money upon billions and billions and billions. Well, now would be billions, then millions. We are never going to get that kind of cash again. So we can only do a certain amount of things as local authority. I think that's our method through our own company. Mark talked about Capsule. Yes, Capsule is there. It's currently losing money. And it's not only about building, it's about repainting houses, which we could use, and those are expertise we could use to build, and strengthen our own company, to develop our own houses and to bring our own land. And I only truly think that is the way we can do it. And I know MHA are dealing now with building they're doing something with Cardiff University where they're building modern bungalows. And what I really stress to you is it's not just about the bottom of the thing. We've got to think of the housing ladder as not a ladder, as a cycle. And we've got to think not only of where people want to start, but where people want to end. And they're using low-cost bungalows developed innovatively with Cardiff University. Are we tapped into that conversation? If not, why not? And one last thing about viability and viability studies of private housing companies who say, oh, it's not viable to build X amount of affordable housing. And I've spoke to Mark about this already, so he knows what's coming, is Bristol have made them publish it publicly. And why don't we? Because that will force some of their thinking, some of their finances, and all of it, because I know some of it's commercially confidential, into the public domain. And guess what? Bristol found that suddenly the housing companies could build more affordable housing. Shock, horror. So let's brace this as opportunity. If we do the same old, we're just going to fail.
Thanks for that. In true form, lots of insightful questions. There'll be a lot of answers, but obviously if you want to come back afterwards in case anything hasn't been clarified for you, feel free to.
We'll do a double act as usual. In terms of the options that we have as local authority, yep, absolutely. As you know, we're already looking at working with RSLs. That's our first foray into the market using Crick Road as our first example. I think we could do a lot better than Crick Road, but what Crick Road has enabled us to do is form a partnership with an RSL that's looking to build out market housing, which they then use to subsidise the affordable housing. Being at that table enables us to input on the design, making sure that we're not just building boxes, but we're looking at the longevity of those houses. We're looking at the infrastructure around those houses, around the green infrastructure, about building in public transport, cycle routes. And Ben has sat in every operational meeting to make sure that they're actually reaching our aspirations. More importantly, we can enforce around affordable housing. It's a line in the sand that we will not cross, albeit we also have procurement rules that we need to address, and how we do that is quite sensitive. So we need to ensure that going forward, we actually do work in the spirit of partnership. So we actually set up joint ventures where we can influence as a landowner and a beneficiary of the output. Now, what that enables us to do is actually accelerate growth. It means that we can influence greater the design standards if we're prepared to take a lower receipt. Because we at the same time are being challenged to generate money to pay for 21st century schools. So we've constantly got competing priorities that we need to consider, and affordable housing is key, but so are there other elements. Setting up our own housing company will enable us to then borrow money and start building. I would suggest in the first instance what we need to do is to do that with partners who already have that structure set up around them. So working with Mellin, they already, as Mark has mentioned, have their own private company. So they've already got expertise which they buy in, that they've actually employed, who are specialists in building. They've actually poached them from the private sector. They know all the games. They know how to play that game. We have expertise in terms of valuers. We also have designers, but we don't have the construction expertise that we will need to bring on board if we actually want to build out these houses at a level that is affordable so that we can actually do more of them. In terms of modular construction, that's something that we are actively looking at the moment. There are many examples in England where they are already building out affordable homes to modular standards. And I know there's been a visit recently, which Councillor Becker went on and actually organised to go and have a look at those modular factories. It's new into the market, but so was timber framed when they first brought that out. There are mortgages available on them now, but in terms of affordability and social rented, that shouldn't be such a problem for the as it would be for low-cost home ownership. So there are lots of exciting opportunities that we can do. If we do set up our own housing company, that makes it less affordable for us, because at this moment in time we can borrow a quite good interest rate through the PWLB. If we go out as an arm's length company, then we then have to start paying commercial rates of borrowing, which then increases our construction costs, increases our viability, our profit, and therefore the amount of units that we can build out. So there are development models. We're doing it now. We're doing it with Crick Road, where we are a partner at the table, but not in a legal sense. The next foray will be through a joint venture, be that through an arm's length company or a JV that's specifically set up to deliver our next site. And the end game, very much, is to set up our own development company, not purely for residential, I have to say, but also for commercial opportunities as well that will fit in with the investment strategy that you have set up.
And really briefly, Chair, was in terms of the other question about the MHA project with Cardiff University. Yeah, we are the pilot authority for that. So we've approved, I can't remember now, if it's 4 or 5 bungalows in Abergavenny and 4 starter units of a different design in Caldecott. They've got 2 other schemes coming forward, but yeah, Professor Wayne Forster from School of Architecture is in touch with me, looking at other projects to do as well. So yeah, we're at the forefront of that.
Sorry, just to say, the questions on the document haven't been answered, and on the joint. Thank you. I've done 2 motions on this, so you know how passionate I am about it. But I'll just beg all members now across all political parties, let's do this. Let's not hang about anymore. Let's just get on with it and just make it happen, because the time is running. But I would appreciate the answers to the questions on the document.
Just before the questions to answer the document, actually, I was going to raise it that actually, in terms of setting up a company, that came from you as a motion. So yeah, it's good to see that it's moving forward. But I think you're right. We need to get on with it. So just the answers to the questions in those documents. There's consultation going on here. Are you all right?
Yeah, I need to give that some more thought, to be honest with you. Work out what the implications are. And how it would work, but I certainly will go away and do that in consultation with Matt Phillips and some legal advice.
Is that about viability?
Yeah, the viability reports, I'm making those public. Yeah, sorry, Shirley was just checking with me. The question was raised earlier, the one that we've left blank, 9A, that I think Councillor Betruni somebody asked, that we haven't completed. Shirley's politely reminded me I was meant to fill that in. And I'm reminding myself why I haven't. I need to give that some thought as well. I'm not really sure what powers they're hinting at that we could use differently, or what legal powers. There was some talk in the document around compulsory purchase. It is very rarely used. We've had some discussions with Welsh Government recently about using that just to bring housing sites forward in Wales, full stop, with some, I don't want to say contradictory, but some slightly unclear advice. The legislation's clear that it is a power we can use, but it's also clear that the state's intervention in private land ownership should be an absolute last resort. And if you're doing a town centre regeneration, it's quite easy to say that particular thing is in the way of that project, and we need to CPO if it can't be resolved another way. If you're just looking at housing land, yeah, there's a field on the edge of Chepstow, for example, but there's a field next door, so is the field we're trying to CPO, is that the only option? Arguably less so than the town centre example. So I'm still unclear about the extent to which we can successfully use CPO for bringing those sites forward. I'm not sure how it would work then in terms of affordable housing, how it would really deliver that. So yeah, we need to give that one a bit more thought. But if members got ideas about legal powers we can use and we're not using, then by all means.
More of an observation or an insight from my perspective as someone who sat on the private sector side between private landowners and commercial companies who develop this. The viability argument is an interesting one. It won't shock you to hear that actually contracts are set up in a way to benefit both parties for viability moving forwards. That's not publicly declared, etc. But it is a game. I think the guys have said previously. I think other people have the observation is that other local authorities do actually employ valuers or use the estates department to run through there. I know we have a slightly different system. I've helped previously is sort of comment on things, but not been maybe responsible for diving really deep into the detail. But yeah, I think you all know the motivations are to minimise the costs, and it's not the planning department's fault. It's not our fault. It's the way the system is set up. So. Yeah, just observation.
And just to add to that, because when I was looking through the report, I know that Shirley was saying that you've been constantly lobbying the Welsh Government to provide viability training to support local authority officers in order to meet their targets. I'd be quite interested, just because it links in, why aren't they providing this training? Why are we having to lobby for this support and training?
Well, they have provided some training to planners.
Thanks to
They've had a couple of courses, but what we are lobbying them for is not really training. It's to pay for some sort of expertise that councils could use, because you can train officers, but that's not our day job. It's very complicated. So it's really, the developers have clubbed together and they've got Savills to do it for them. And we'd really like some form of being able to club together and have some experts to do it for us.
Yeah, just a quick comment on that. We all went to university for quite a while to learn how to do these sort of things. It's not straightforward, and each site is completely bespoke. So assuming that there is a way of saying a standard set of rules is not correct. It's an individual call on every single site based on the parties, the land, the various abnormals that are there, and the value that needs to be pulled out. So it's not a mathematical sum. It's a judgment in some cases, but it's one should be made by a professional trained in that area, in my opinion.
So that's something that we have to really put strongly in the report, is a way of us being able to meet the targets, that Welsh Government give more support in that area then to help us meet our targets.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, I suppose I'm just thinking through what is the solution we're asking them for. I think what we're all agreed on is it isn't our policies or our approach, it's the general system. And I don't know how we change that. I do know what has been working in some regards, which skips onto the second topic, which is where people have come in with unallocated sites. It's almost as though a whole balance of power has changed. And we are saying it's 35% or you can go away. And we're getting 35%. So in a backwards sense, when it's in your LDP and you have a target that you have to deliver, we need that site to come forward almost as much as they want it to financially. And then you end up in this funny relationship. So it is it's a very backwards argument, because you end up going down the line, well, the way to get 35% is not to allocate sites in an LDP if you don't have planning. It's completely backwards if you take it to its extreme. And that isn't the solution. But we've looked at it from all angles. And it is complex. I think without going on too much about viability, the two big things that we're never going to get around are a private sector company will build if they make a profit, and if they don't make a profit that they deem to be acceptable, they will not build, and then we'll get 35% of nothing. That is the harsh reality. And also a landowner will only sell a bit of land once. They need to feel like they're getting enough money to make it worth their while to part with it. And if they think the market's going up and they are able financially to take a longer term view, then they will. And some of our landowners are quite comfortable thinking of their great-grandchildren rather than the here and now, because it is a relatively affluent county, where in some other areas you'd allocate a bit of land in a plan and it'll be for sale the next day, because they're really keen to release that money. Some of our landowners can take a far, far greater view, long-term view. So we have got to weigh that up. We've got to appreciate they will only, if you think about your own land, if for some reason you were going to build a house in your garden, you've got the build costs, you've got the profit coming from when you sell it, you're going to have some costs for marketing it in the process, some things like drainage you'll have to deal with and pay for, and then you've got to realise your big garden is now a slightly smaller garden, so what your current house is worth is now less. So where's that tipping point? You might make 50 grand profit from building a house. If we say we want 30 grand of that for affordable housing, is 20 grand enough for you to still do it? Or is it no longer in your interests? So that's what every single landowner's doing on a far bigger scale, is working out where that tipping point lies. So that's essentially the debates we always end up in, and it's how you break it almost.
It's interesting. Just, I'm aware it's 11:20. I've got Councillor Becker, Councillor Feekins, I've got Councillor Pavier, and then Councillor Harris again. I'm just concerned on time, but if there's any burning questions, obviously feel free to ask the questions, or there might be questions that you could ask when we're looking at the next agenda. Okay then, so Jez.
Thanks, Debbie. Right, a little bit of interaction first. Hands up, everybody who knows what a community land trust is. Okay, I'm going to read the definition from the Community Land Trust Network so that we can try and get it up to speed not from my Wittering version, but from the proper version. So, community land trusts are a form of community-led housing set up and run by ordinary people to develop and manage homes as well as other assets. CLTs act as long-term stewards of housing, ensuring that it remains genuinely affordable based on what people actually earn in their area, not just now, but for every future occupier. Okay? Let's sort of paraphrase that down. This is an organisation formed out of people normally in the community who come together and build houses for a specific purpose. Let's say for the young people in their community who can't afford to buy any houses. As it is set up as a CLT, those houses are then asset locked into what is a community company so that they in perpetuity remain affordable. So if they build them and say, right, we're going to build these things so that you can buy them for £100,000 so that you can live in them, you can afford to do it, you can't live in it for 2 years and then sell it for X amount of money. You've got to sell it at the same degree of affordability as it was built. And it remains in perpetuity locked in this way. There's quite a few sort of examples of these done in different environments. There's one down in, I think it was in Devon, where a farmer gave a piece of land and they built it for the young people. There's one in South London where they converted a building and you had people living in there with 2-bedroom flats for around 200,000, which for South London is insane. So what you have is a structure that is becoming more popular of how to provide a type of housing that you can define who you want to live there in the sense of, let's say it's 40% local people and 40% for the ageing population, and we want to reserve the rest for people under 40 with their first home. Something like that. You can require different types of entry criteria for them. Then obviously you have to build them. This is where we come to the bit where we at the moment are enthralled to the big five, and as has just been pointed out quite ably, people build for a profit. Except that community land trusts don't build for a profit. They're a community interest company. You can set them up as a CIC. They tend to have a board made up of the people who will live in the houses. And they have a strict and rigid legal definition around what they can and can't do. So one of the things they can't do is make a load of profit. For a CIC, sometimes you can pay out certain amounts of money if you make money, but mostly everything is asset locked into the actual site that you're building. So you remove the idea that you're building these things for profit. How do you then actually build them and make them affordable is the next obvious question. Firstly, you can do it by getting the land at a preferential rate. Now, in the case of somewhere like in Devon, it was a farmer who literally gave over the land and said, if you're going to do this for the local community, I'm all for you having this land for a quid. Now, we have a land shortage in this county, so that is less likely. But if you're really serious about doing something about it, this council has stated that it wants to maximise profits from selling off its assets. Well, backtrack from that. How do you define profit? As money, or as building some of these houses that we desperately need for our young people who are leaving the county, thus leaving us with a burden of an ageing population which we can't service in our social care? So we could say, take the council farms, which are already being eyed up as being less viable than they used to be. Why don't we actually turn those over to a CIC and allow CIC to use something like the modular housing, which has been alluded to. I've already taken some of the officers on a visit to see some examples of that, to build these community land trusts, which will remain in perpetuity locked to be affordable for the residents of the county. So that's the one big nugget that I'd like you all to sort of chew on over a while, and I'm sure the officers will have some comments on that. We don't seem to have any sort of policy or any real plan to make use of that kind of element in the mix. I'm not saying it's a panacea and it solves everything, but it's certainly, there is room in the mix to perform that kind of thing, and I'm sure we're going to hear about it. I'll probably leave it at that because everybody said what I want to say about viability, which is my other big bugbear. I will say on the modular building front, the visit that was talked about is we went up to see a factory, the L&G, is it L&G? Yeah, Legal and General. They are building these homes in a huge factory out of cross-laminated timber. And we saw the example homes. It was very impressive, very solid. It's a great sort of... their mission stated is to help rebalance the housing market, which means that they would be very open to working with things like either the building arms of the RSLs that we've got in county, or with the CIC, for trying to provide in bulk the kind of housing that they are producing in their factory. So they've got an aim of producing 60,000 units a year. You know, it would be interesting to see where they are at the end of the year in that aim. But certainly, you're looking at a technology which dovetails with a legal structure which would allow us to achieve some of these aims that we've all been saying about. So, really, any questions?
I was going to say that's a session in itself, actually. I mean, I think it's really interesting, the idea of a community land trust, and something that shouldn't get lost. And I guess we need to kind of look at the process to how we take this forward, because I suspect this should have a discussion on that in one of the scrutiny select committees, I think. Because I think if we started discussing it now, we'd be here for a very long time, because it is, I think it's an interesting area. I just want to move on to Matt Feekson.
Thank you, Chair. A couple of points to pick up, really. First of all, backtracking right to the beginning, just discussing AQR. I think what we're building and what we're comfortable with having built is one thing. I think what the market is building and what the market is willing to provide to the market, to the people who want to buy houses, is something different. I don't think we should get involved with it. I've got friends that with 2 people working are struggling to get enough funds together to buy a house at 145 grand. If we're stopping developers bringing forward those houses, we're effectively preventing those younger couples, younger people getting onto the housing market, or getting onto the housing ladder or circle, or however you want to call it, but we're preventing those units coming forward. So I would encourage everyone to withstand that sort of direction of travel, albeit that we can hold our own heads up high and make sure that we build our own places up to a much higher standard. But let's not get involved with the market housing. Going into compulsory purchase, I don't think compulsory purchase is sensible. I don't think it's good. A lot of the council housing that has been built previously, going into the 50s and 60s and 70s, was built on council-owned land or was compulsory purchased. I don't think that's a road that we should be going down. I think we sat in this committee are wearing 2 hats. We are landowners. We're bringing sites forward ourselves. We're using the receipts from that to build schools. And we certainly wouldn't like it if we was losing those receipts to build the schools, to put the children through, if that land had been compulsory purchased off ourselves in that scenario. So I don't think that's a route we should go down whatsoever. I think that the 25% element that we've got at the moment in the south of the county is probably wrong as we are at the moment, looking at the effects of the 7 bridge tolls coming off. They wasn't coming off when we was going into the LDP. They are now coming off. The increase in prices in the south of the county has been significant. We could, if there was a possibility through an SPG process, maybe increase that up to 30-35%. Maybe not, no. Okay. But there's certainly, I think that's something we need to think about moving forward into the next LDP, because I think there is a difference. It's a different market now to what it was when the LDP when we went into it. But I think the nub of the problem for all of this, and this is with the developer's hat on, is supply and demand. If we increase the number of sites coming forward in this county, we will decrease the prices of land to the market. Plot prices in Hereford are half the price of what they are in this county. That's what we're one county over. And one of the reasons for that, there are lots of neighbourhood plans, and around lots of the villages and infill places, a lot of sites have come forward with 5, 10, 15 units, up to 25 units. And all of a sudden, you've got the amount of plots available in Herefordshire has increased exponentially over the last 2 years, probably 300% increase. And suddenly the plot prices went from 200 grand down to you're struggling to sell them at 80 grand. When we look at affordable housing and when we go back to the developers, notwithstanding what Ben said regarding developers' profit, or developers have to have profits, we're pretty much in the lap of 3 or 4 large developers, PLCs. We're going to struggle to fight against them against their build costs. When the DVS look at the viability of a site, they know the developer's margin, they know the cost of building a house. The fat, if you like, the affordable housing margin comes out of the cost of land. The cost of land is what it is because we are quite strong in our position of about how much land we bring forward to the market. The nub of the problem is if we were to increase the number of sites coming forward, we would decrease the number of the value of land, and therefore we would have the affordable housing units being delivered. We would have less troubles with viability. So that's a very real issue which we definitely need to consider moving forward in the LDP. Let's be more ambitious with the number of sites we bring forward. But going back to the Welsh Government consultation, if they really wanted to change the position, and it's within their gift to do it now, and it's something that maybe we could suggest to them, when we've got a call for sites out at the moment, if you were to say to those landowners, look, we're going to put a call for sites out, but you need to make a declaration, when you're asking us to consider your site, if you're willing to make a declaration to say that you would be willing to accept a 30% affordable housing contribution off of that land, and we will consider your house on that element alone. So basically, you would be tying in that land almost as a condition of that land coming forward, that we would already have a prerequisite of 25%, 30% on that land. That means the developer buying that piece of land would know at that point in time the cost of that land and the cost of delivering that land. They know their margins. They know that game already. If that landowner was willing to bring that land forward at 30%, that might mean that some landowners don't bring their land forward. It might well do that, but there'll be others that will. There'll be plenty of others that will, I promise you that. You could put a restricted covenant on that land to say that this land can only be delivered if there is a 30% provision being made available. The way Welsh Government could help with that is they could give tax relief on that affordable housing provision. At the moment, obviously, a farmer buys a piece of land 30 years ago, cost £1,000 an acre. That land is now £10,000 an acre. You sell it for planning at 80 grand an acre. You've got to pay capital gains on that. Capital gains at 40% on £80,000. The taxman is sat there with his money, he's collecting large receipts. This isn't all going to the landowner by any stretch of the imagination. If the Welsh Government, which is within their gift to do it now at the present, if they were to give tax relief on the capital gains value going back to the landowner for the landowners that were willing to subjugate their land into affordable housing, or with the prerequisite of affordable housing being a covenant onto the land, then we would be square in the circle, and we would be moving forward into a position in time where we would have more land coming forward. There would be less chances for developers to reduce the or to argue the viability assessment. But the nub of the problem is the supply of land.
Thanks for that. Some useful suggestions. So you're scribbling things down there, Mark?
I'm regretting eating the mint now.
Went too far away, couldn't get the sweets.
I'll chuck them down now. In terms of the LDP process, the Welsh Government commissioned something called the Arcadis report that looked at why sites aren't coming forward. The issues are completely different across Wales. You can imagine our issues here are very different to RCT, for example. But something that came from that is the next LDP, by the time we go to deposit with the plan, so by the time we submit it to Welsh Government and say, this is the plan, we think it sounds, we will need to have evidence and confidence that sites are deliverable, including viability information. So it's not quite, it's not going as far as you're suggesting, Councillor Feekins, with some kind of legal covenant or restriction on them, but it's heading in that direction. I think the weakness in the current proposals, albeit that they're far better than they in past times, is we will be sat there in 2020 talking about evidence from 2020, but will that still hold true in 2033, which is when the plan runs to? A lot's happened in the last 15 years. No one really knows what's going to happen in the next 15. So we're going to have that. Developers, we've engaged with developers in how we're doing our candidate sites, because we've deliberately kept this first stage really light touch, and we haven't asked for all of that information yet. That'll come later. But they're very clear that they won't do all of their very significantly expensive due diligence work on a specific site until they've got the confidences in the plan, because they'll spend tens, nearly hundreds of thousands of pounds promoting a site to get it an LDP. And they work, or they're telling me they have around about a 30% success rate. So round about a third of what they promote actually gets into a plan. The other 2/3 are wasted money, if you like. So they're always playing that game on a kind of the big PLC basis. So they're mindful of how much they spend on a particular site. So the stuff that really trips them up financially and comes in as abnormals that Ben mentioned, and then affects us with viability, is the stuff that they're saying they don't know about at that stage. So quite how we square that off, I don't quite know. I think the other point I'd make just really quickly is, I think Councillor Feakins, one of the essences of what you were saying was provide more land for development. And a comment that Councillor Becker made was we have a shortage of land in the county. We do, but that's a man-made shortage. The data is that 3% of Monmouthshire is defined as urban, built on. So, the county is not going to get bigger. I'm not saying that we should build on all of it or anywhere near, but we do have a lot of land physically. We have a lot of land that's not suitable for building on for all kinds of reasons, floodplains, historic heritage. We don't want to ruin the very thing that makes the county beautiful and really shoot ourselves in the foot. But we don't have a shortage of land in the strictest sense. There is land there. It's our choice where we draw those lines in the next LDP. So that is a solution that's before us if that's one that we want to take.
Thank you, Chair. This is probably a question directed to Mark, really, and it's around question 8 in the consultation response, looking at capacity of the public sector and RSLs. And I'm just wondering, it's clear from local housing market assessments and issues around capacity of staff and expertise, not just here but across the region. What is the regional dimension of this now? I know, prior to the Cabinet Secretary for Public Services putting local reorg back in the box again, there was concern about, a drive to more collaboration and regionalised planning, notwithstanding, the strategic planning element that's already built in legislation. But just trying to mitigate some of this, we're a lean team here, the planning team, that's probably replicated across the region. I'm just wondering what Welsh Government's thoughts and thinking are about sort of regionalisation of capacity and expertise, and I think there's a prime example about in regard to that, particularly in the social care sector, where we looked at regional partnership boards going down. I know they've been guided by legislation, but looking at the care home and residential care home capacity across the region, and the information sharing and analysis that's been done across local authorities has been extremely helpful, and it has offered a huge degree of transparency as well. Not just amongst local authorities, but market companies as well, and the NHS in terms of what is being spent, and that sort of regional shaping has been really, really helpful, notwithstanding pool budgets and the disagreements. Well, we'll put that aside, but in terms of the sort of the information sharing has been really helpful. So I just wonder what the thinking is, because I know you're on one of the ministerial advisory groups or working groups. I just wondered what that sort of thinking is around that.
In terms of any kind of formal proposals from the Welsh Government, I mean, they come and go. I think we're currently off on that approach. But there's a load of work, an awful lot of work goes on at an officer level in terms of, I describe as collaboration rather than regional working. So there is a group of us that I chair meetings for that are looking at the South East Wales Strategic Development Plan and how we're going towards that. But there's also a separate group, which I also chair, which is a South East Wales Strategic Planning Group, SUSPUG, nice catchy name. That's been meeting for decades, but now we've really got our teeth into some stuff. So we've drawn up, for example, I talked earlier about candidate sites. We've drawn up a regional methodology for doing that, which I think there's 7 of the 10 of us in South East Wales should be doing a new LDP. I don't think everyone is, but according to the Welsh Government, 7 of us should be. So looking at doing that in a consistent manner. We're working, we've also already agreed an employment survey methodology, so we're all getting the same data in the same way at the same time, and we end up with some comparable data that we can clump together and aggregate or disaggregate as we need to. So that might sound like real common sense, but trying to get 10 authorities around the table and agree to that is hard work at times. So we got there with those bits. We are moving really closely in parallel timing-wise with Torvine, who's doing their new LDP. So there's areas of work we've agreed to work with them, and in principle with Blaenau Gwent, although they're yet to make the decision that they are definitely doing a new LDP. I believe it's imminent. But we're working really closely with them to see what we can do jointly, share the costs, share the expertise. So all of that stuff is happening. But I think it's all in the context of it still being 10 authorities in South East Wales. We're doing our own LDP, and Council made the decision to support that rather than doing a joint plan for the reasons that were discussed in Council back in May, I think it was. So I think it's around how we do that. So the strategic matters will be dealt with in this new SDP of how some of those cross-boundary issues are dealt with. But I think the complexity comes in. We still feel strongly as officers it is a local development plan for Monmouthshire that needs to do what we need. Some of our challenges are quite different to our neighbours. So there's a load of areas we can work with them, but other areas where we need a bit of a bespoke approach. So, for example, 60-40 housing sites, 60% affordable. It's bespoke to Monmouthshire at the moment anyway, but I can only really see that working in the Vale of Glamorgan. I don't think it'll work in other parts of South East Wales region. So that's our approach to it at the moment, and I think that's how I foresee it keeping working, unless there's some new other grand idea. But a lot of the work we're doing in South East Wales is likely to get rolled out into other parts of Wales. So the SDP, the Strategic Development Plan, we're forging the path on that in South East Wales. So I think others will learn from our successes and failures on the way.
Thanks, Mark. Just to come back on that, and I suppose following that was useful. But what are the RSLs doing as well about the issue of capacity? I mean, are they having conversations amongst themselves regionally, because it seems, that the cost of the skilled person is rising. Obviously beneficial to the member of staff, but not necessarily beneficial to the RSL and to the sector. If you're just poaching each other's assets, staff assets, it's not helpful. It's not conducive really and sustainable long term. Just wonder what they're doing as well to meet that need.
Yeah, partly the nature of South East Wales means that we do end up with this little motion. So you'll probably recall we employed an extra person to help us do the new LDP. So we've appointed internally. We've then backfilled that by pinching somebody from RCT. Somebody's on maternity leave, and we backfilled that by pinching somebody from Blaenau Gwent. RCT's no advertising, so you end up with this little, we've just lost a member, we're about to lose a member of the housing team to MHA. So you do end up with this little cycle. It's largely just a natural thing in local government anyway. One vacancy means this whole little cycle of moving over a period of time. Shirley, are you aware of any other discussions they have jointly, either as a genus group in Harpur Gwent or elsewhere? One of the questions that's partly related within the document suggests whether or not, at the moment, we have 3 identified RSLs that work within Monmouthshire. One of the questions suggests, should it be restricted in that way or should it be open to all? I think our view very much is it works as it is. We have really strong working relationships with those 3, and positively so. I think if you open it up to all, you almost risk them competing with each other in some almost backward market being created. If they start competing with each other to buy housing sites, we're driving the land values up. So it could end up being a bit backwards.
Thanks for that, Mark. I've got Roger and Ruth who want to come in. Matt, did you want to come back on that quickly first?
Just on that one very point, then I think that's probably the wrong. My own thinking is that's probably the wrong move to restrict the number of RSLs we're working with. I think that if we leave ourselves open to work with others, I know of new RSLs which are being set up, which are more competitive than existing RSLs, simply because they're newer, leaner, meaner machines, and not working in our area just at the present, but they're looking to cover the gap between Cardiff and Bristol. And I think that we would be selling ourselves short if we were to exclude them. Not saying we're, through all the due diligence and everything else you'd expect in normal circumstances, but if they're working elsewhere and they're more competitive elsewhere, then I don't think we should be restrictive. Otherwise, we're sort of creating a monopoly for our own markets if we're not careful.
Thank you, Chair. Yes, just coming back on what Mark mentioned about 10 minutes ago, talking about the large developers, private developers, having profitability in mind. Now, I don't know for certain, but as far as I do know, and I'm open for correction here, the bottom line for any of these big developers is a profit of at least 20%. And that is set against the viability. If their bottom line is, we won't do it unless we make 20% profit, and that means, therefore, the affordable aspect, we're just not going to be able to afford. What I'm saying is there's absolutely no flexibility there whatsoever. If it is a bottom line of 20%, we're missing out on the affordable housing, and that is directly down to the 4 or 5 big developers saying we will not be flexible. So we've got to keep that in mind if that is the case. And if it is the case, then again, as I've mentioned before, some of these developers should be ashamed of themselves.
Thanks, Roger. Ruth, you're my final one, and then we'll summarise, unless there's anybody with any burning. No. We'll quickly summarise, and then what we suggest is have a comfort break of about 5 minutes, and then crack on for the second part. Is that okay? So, Ruth?
Right, thank you, Chair. It's like Mark said earlier, we have got a beautiful county, and we don't want to spoil what we're trying to look after. But after the war, there were several council houses building in, say, 6 or 8 would it be in most villages in those days, because they were earmarked for farm workers and so on. It is very, very difficult, as we all know, to build in the open countryside. But we mustn't get away from the fact that that countryside has to be cared for. It doesn't just happen. And if we've got youngsters, I've got children as well, and if they want to live near the farm or something, they certainly cannot afford to live in houses that, in my locality, 500,000 up to $1 million and all that sort of thing. And I think if we had our own firm of building back to our own control of council housing in this county, we'd have a little bit more control as to where and when we can build. And on the land, a lot of villages were crying out when we did the LTP last time to have 4 or 5 houses built there to keep the community alive, to keep people, not just the youngsters, but even older people who wanted to stay in the locality with families that can support them. Because at the end of the day, our public transport is absolutely non-existent. And it also means then that people who come and live in the county, they don't necessarily work here, but then of course they all have to have cars and travel. And we all know what the state of our roads are in Monmouthshire, and it's a bottomless pit to keep on top of it. But whoever comes to live in these big estates, a lot of them are travelling out to work, and that isn't helping our county or our youngsters. Thank you.
Thanks for that, Councillor Edwards. What I'll try and do is just quickly summarise. I think it's been useful in terms of, I think for us as members, with the officers filling in the gaps, so we've got more knowledge and better understanding, and hopefully a lot of the information given by members, insights, observations is useful for you. And I say I've seen you scribbling away there, so hopefully a lot of that information will end up in the final report going through to Welsh Government. Just very quickly as I go through, I think one of the main areas that seem to come out is we must build more, but not at the cost of quality. And I think that started with Maureen. You mentioned it. You started the ball rolling on that we do need to build for the future. And we need to take space into account. And again, I think Martin and Ruth talked about that as well. It's future-proofing the accommodation. I think Louise then linked in that we do need quality for our affordable housing, but actually we need some sort of standard set for the market housing as well. But that was interesting as Matt sort of brings in some, perhaps we shouldn't get involved in the marketing, the private marketing industry, and leave that to supply and demand. So there was interesting debate there, but ultimately I think we were looking down, we do need quality there. Roger, and again, other people brought in this in terms of developers. I think you used the word, they need to cough up the money for affordable housing. And there is some debate to be had about this, the viability issues. We're saying that we need more capacity or support so that officers have a better understanding of viability so that we can provide more affordable housing. Again, Jane spoke of space standards. Interestingly, there is qualities on space standards in England, but we haven't got one in Wales. So obviously that's something maybe as an authority we could lobby on, push forward on that. And Martin again talked about, people need quality accommodation. We need to help people to have a positive start in life, and good quality accommodation is definitely a massive part of that. So that is definitely the trend, I think, going. And I know it was put in the report, Shirley, that you made a passionate plea again. We need to build for the future. It's about sustainability. So we do need to have this DQR there. So I think we're all saying we're supporting that. There's a lot of other sort of issues that were coming in. As say Phil was saying, it's frustrating because all the ducks are in the row, and then Welsh Water say, nah, sorry, you can't build, and that can be very frustrating. So it's ways of getting around that. Young people, definitely. Joe spoke of this again. Jane spoke of this. Young people, we need to get first-time buyers accommodation for people. Jo can't be excused for her Lib Dem plug of buy your own home, but it raised debate, so that was good. Dimitri, again, some interesting stuff there, backed up with Jez's sort of discussion on community land trusts. So with the community land trusts, obviously, there was kind of like a presentation there. I think it's seeds in our head, but again, guidance, how can we make sure this goes forward so we don't just leave it here? Obviously, we'll be sort of thinking about it, but how can we take, I guess I'm asking you, how can we take this forward so it's not just left?
I think it probably gets wrapped up into a similar conversation about whether Monmouthshire builds itself. Builds homes itself. I was almost going to ask Councillor Becker the question when he was speaking, but he pretty much answered it as to what does he need from us enjoying flipping the scrutiny. In terms of planning policies, what does a CLT need? I think the answer that came out from when he was speaking was almost it's more about us as a landowner and than necessarily planning policies. But the planning side of things, you know, we can work through with the next LDP and talk through if there's different things we can do. And it might be linked into the comment that Councillor Edwards made at the very end about the small villages. That's entirely within our gift in the next LDP. We draw those settlement boundaries, we draw that line. We can draw it wherever we like, within reason.
Just like, I mean, that would be a prime example of where a community land trust would have been absolutely perfect. You know, there would have been a willingness from the community and from the landowners, and we could have created a fertile ground for that to happen.
So if for me, I'd like something logged. So what next on that? So it's not left, because I say there's elements being picked up, and it is open to debate because there is sort of issues on economic principles, and I think Matt raised a few of those. So I think it's a good thing to sort of take forward. Also on the back of Dimitri. And let me have a look. Again, the other thread was this capacity, and Paul asked some good questions around that and some suggestions in terms of regionalisation of expertise. So I think that is the summary of the day. So really, we need to build more, but not at the cost of losing quality. We are needing to really focus on first-time buyers, properties for young people to come into the area, it seems. And the last one is we do need support, maybe resources, money from Welsh Government in terms of building up the capacity of our staff, not just time, but also expertise as well, with all the extra stuff that needs to be done. So I think that is the summary. Everybody happy with that? Oh, Shirley, yeah.
Could I just add to that, the high street locations? I think that's very important that be looked at. I know you said it's problematic, but I do think there is, an item that we really need to consider.
And I would just add on to that, because again, it was something that Jane said, no excuses in terms of when you're looking at refurbishment. If the private market can do it, there should be no excuses. And so, yes, I would put that forward as well. Sorry, I kind of missed that. And that is a really important point. Absolutely, yeah.
Thanks, Chair. That's really helpful. Comfort break now, you mentioned. Please come back for part 2, though. Yeah. And there is lunch afterwards.
I think, obviously, you know that part 2 is really important because there'll be a final decision on the 20th at the full council. A lot of this information will feed into that discussion. So what do you think? Can people cope with 5 minutes, 7 minutes? If I say 7 minutes, wow. 5. Go on, then.
Okay, councillors, welcome back to part two. Councillor Brakebutt done a superb job warming you all up this morning. Always the warm-up act is always the most difficult. You're gonna you see all the tomato stains you've got down your front. No, thank you for the contributions this morning. Really, really helpful. The second part of this is obviously interlinked, and it's regarding our lack of 5-year housing land supply and how we're going to address that as an authority. As Councillor Blakeburn said and Mark Hand said earlier on, there is going to be a report to the next council meeting on the 20th. So any contributions, recommendations even, that you feel as a joint committee you would like to put forward in that final report to give council a steer, that would be really, really helpful. I know Mark and the team would really appreciate that. Before we go into the nuts and bolts, we've obviously had a change of personnel down the front. New officers have joined us. So can we just have a brief introduction from starting with you, Phil, and then go in right? Is that okay? Yes.
Yes, I think some of the members know me. Phil Thomas, Development Services Manager with the Planning Service.
I'm Sarah Jones, Principal Planning Policy Officer.
I'm David Wong, Planning Policy Team.
That's great. That's great. Thanks very much. Very welcome, and look forward to your contributions to this debate. The prime, I suppose, issue before we go into the LDP itself and the full review of that is the suspension of paragraph 6.2 in TAN 1, which Welsh Government have decided to take, which takes away the factor of weighting in terms of planning weight on. I haven't got my note here. I'm sure Mark will go into detail, but that's the issue we need to focus on and how we manage that going forward between now and when our final LDP is in place. This is going to sort of tide us over really in the interim, so it is really important. So Mark, do you want to take us through? Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Chair. I got a few slides just to take us through the background to the concept and options available and sort of the officer recommendation in the council report that's drafted behind the scenes. Awaiting your feedback as well. I put this slide up just trying to set out what the problem we're trying to fix is, but we have essentially talked about this for the last 2 hours this morning, so I don't really think I need to go through that unless you want to. It's topics you've heard us talk about before, you've talked to us about, all around our ageing population, the economic strength or weakness rather of our demography. Where are those 20 to 40-year-olds going? I know it's strictly speaking 20s and 30s, but I'm trying to encourage myself. I'm not that old. We've got the highest average house prices in Wales now. They've topped £310,000, and that is an average house price. So it is significant, especially when you think of some of those other government incentives like Help to Buy. There's a cap on those at 300k. So our average house is now beyond that, which is worrying. Significant affordable housing need we talked about this morning. Rural isolation we talked about this morning. Opportunities on the other side. Economically, we all know around City Deal, Cardiff Capital Region, but also looking over the border west and what's happening there and the 7 tolls. And then not to forget the bits in the middle at the bottom. We can have all this great stuff. We've also got historic market towns, significant heritage assets, beautiful landscapes, and some infrastructure challenges. So we need to bear all of that in mind going forwards, both next LDP and in the short term. So in terms of the context of discussion, national planning policy and guidance about housing land supply is in this document called TAN 1, Technical Advice Note 1. We have to have, according to national policy, at least a 5-year land supply. We currently have 3.9 years. It's been slowly but progressively decreasing since 2015-16. We did know that would happen to an extent because of the way it's calculated and the way housing sites are coming forwards. But what used to happen until around about July was paragraph 6.2 of TAN 1 said, if you don't have a 5-year land supply, housing land supply, we have to give that considerable weight when we're dealing with planning applications for schemes outside of the LDP. So unallocated sites, I'll keep calling them, but in essence, you'll have sites with allocated in the LDP, you'll have settlement boundaries. Anything outside of that is unallocated sites. So just to be clear, things like Crick Road, they're an LDP allocation. That's all part of the LDP. Things like the Magistrates Court site in Abergavenny, that's within the settlement boundary. So that isn't what we're talking about now. That kind of stuff can all still happen. This is sites that aren't in the LDP. So in committee, we've dealt with Grove Farm in Llanfoist and Rockfield Farm in Monmouth and approved those two. We've got current application in Raglan and a current application in Caldecott at Church Road. They're examples of unallocated sites. So albeit that the policy used to say we had to give it considerable weight, our lack of land supply, the proposals still have to be acceptable in all other planning terms. So this isn't a case of build anything anywhere, and throw caution to the winds. The scheme still had to be acceptable. So it wasn't stuff in the middle of nowhere. It wasn't stuff that's going to cause an unacceptable impact on highway safety or air quality or the like. However, having said all of that, this paragraph 6.2, as Councillor Pavia mentioned, is now suspended. The Welsh Government's made that decision. However, the letter that came out from the Cabinet Secretary, which has been sent out to you in advance, says it's for the decision maker, i.e. us as a council, to determine the weight to be attributed to the need to increase housing land supply where there is a shortfall. So we have a shortfall. So it's essentially now down to us as a council to work out how much weight we give that housing land supply shortfall. And in essence, the options are no weight up to considerable weight back where we started. So we've already had a bit of a discussion at the end of the last two planning committee meetings, just to put that idea out there and start thinking about it. But we haven't had a proper discussion or come to any conclusions. This is the main part of the process in terms of shaping those ideas. And then we're aiming for a decision from council on the 20th. So in essence, two options, if I break it down to its simplest. One is do nothing, say that we won't give any weight to our housing land shortfall. We'll stick firmly to the LDP. If it's allocated in the LDP, it's fine. If it's within a settlement boundary in the LDP, it's fine in principle. Everything else is a no. And the main advantage of doing that is we have a proper plan-led system, which is what we're supposed to have in theory. So our starting point in all our planning decisions, the LDP, we'll stick with that approach. If it's not in the plan, it's a no. The big disadvantage to that approach is the shortcomings in housing delivery, which I'll come to the detail of. But in essence, we've projected forwards to the end of the plan period, which is the end of 2021, and will be 961 dwellings short of where we should be based on those projections, of which 337 of those are affordable houses. So I'll talk about how we've come to those figures in a second. But option one is without doubt the safest in terms of procedure. We're sticking to what the legislation says. Decisions in accordance with the LDP. It's not in the LDP, the answer is no. The other option is that we do give our housing land supply shortfall some weight. The question then is how much. And the advantage of that is it tackles the very problems we've been talking about this morning. It also means we'd hit the ground running with our next LDP. So I think one of the things we talked around, but not really specifically today, is leading up to this LDP, I think we took the view that new sites were premature. We'd wait till the plan was adopted, then deal with them. The LDP actually says we expected all of our strategic sites to have consent by the end of 2014. You'll know that hasn't been the case for all kinds of reasons. But even now, there's still sites in the LDP that don't have planning permission yet. So in terms of bringing that stuff forward, if we follow a clear evidence-based strategy, then this is a way in which we can deliver housing, tackle those problems, and I'd argue to is best in terms of outcome. But it is that kind of choice. If you want to just stick with procedure, option one, stick with the LDP is safest. Outcome, I'd suggest to you, we should be giving weight to our LDP. And there's some stuff around that. So if I just finish a couple of slides and then we'll go into a discussion around all of those points. The data, in the appendices to the report, and these will be in the council report as well, there's 2 tables. It's exactly the same data, just broken down in 2 different ways. Because there's almost 2 different ways of looking at it. So this one shows it broken down by housing market area. The other one looks at the LDP spatial strategy and the hierarchy of settlements. So if you look at it by, it's perhaps easier actually to go the other way around. If you look at it by the LDP spatial strategy, the top of that hierarchy is our main towns: Chepstow, Abergavenny, and Monmouth. Then we've got Sevenside. Then we've got what we call the rural secondary settlements, which are Usk, Penberthleni, Llanfoist, and Raglan. And then we have main villages. So we have LDP allocations in all of those. But in terms of the main villages, it is just those small 60% affordable housing sites between 5 and 15 dwellings, and then much bigger sites the further up you go. So you know about the bigger sites: Vinegar Hill, Rockfield Farm, in Meagerundy, Crick Road you know about. So that gives you an idea of the scale. What this data shows us is, in the first column is completions. This is the same in both tables. So that's actual officers go out and count at least once a year how many houses have been completed and where. So stuff that's actually happened between 2011, when the LDP started, even though it wasn't adopted yet, that's when the plan period started, and the end of March 2018. And then the next 3 columns look at projections. So small site windfalls. By windfall, we mean sites that have come forwards within settlement boundaries, but we weren't predicting them, we weren't banking on them necessarily. Large-scale windfalls, an example of that is the Magistrates' Court in Abergavenny. So it's within a settlement boundary, it's acceptable in principle in an LDP sense, but it isn't an allocation. It's not shaded in pink or whatever the colour was in the LDP. So projections for small site windfalls, large site windfalls, and then the allocated sites. So things like Crick Road, those ones that we mentioned, Derry Farm. They are taken from our 5-year housing land supply. National policy sets out a very clear methodology of how you calculate it. We have to do projections each year for the next 5 years going forwards for each site that either has planning permission or is an allocation in the plan. And that's that data. But that is 3 years worth of that data. So it actually takes us up to the end of March 2022. So it slightly over-predicts, if you like. And we're talking about 2021 because that's when our current LDP ends. The next column is a total, and then you've got the LDP targets, which is how much the LDP should have been delivering in those places by the end of 2021. And then the final column is the balance. So the LDP target, the total that is being delivered minus the LDP target. So you can see on there, Abergavenny is delivering 479 units, of which 139 are affordable, should be delivering 566, of which 181 are affordable. So we're 87 houses down in total, 42 of which are a market. So it gives a breakdown in a different way. The grand total at the bottom is 961 dwellings, of which 337 are affordable. The other way of looking at it is on the housing market areas. So we've got 3 housing market areas in the county. The south, which is essentially Chepstow, Sevenside and those surrounding areas. The central area, which is Monmouth, and then a big swathe across the middle. So it includes Usk, Raglan, Penberthleni, and all of that band. And then the northern area, which is Abergavenny and Llanfoist and the small villages around there. So the evidence is showing us the shortfall is primarily in Chepstow and Sevenside, which coincides where I think we're clear from the evidence is where our greatest growth pressures are with the Seven Tolls and Bristol economy, Cardiff economy, M4 corridor. Some of those other areas are either pretty much quids in with what they should be developing or slightly above. So you'll see, just by way of quick explanation, Monmouth itself is actually up 47 dwellings. The reason for that is because we've approved an unallocated site already at Rockfield Road in Monmouth. So factoring that in as well means it'll be slightly overachieving against the LDP target. And the same is true of Llanfoist right down the bottom, which is 86 dwellings up and quids in on affordable. You probably can't see that because it's at the bottom of the screen. So that's to explain why those two are positives and give you that bit of context. So really, it comes back to the initial two options of, do we say we give no weight to our shortfall of housing land supply between now and the new LDP, or if we're giving some weight, how do we do that and how much? So if we are giving it weight, we're suggesting we could use the data in that previous table to make an evidence-based strategy. And then we're looking at how far do you take that. So we know the greatest shortfall of market housing and affordable housing is in Chepstow and Sevenside. So if we're doing an evidence-based strategy, that would be our starting points. However, we also know as officers, we have queries all the time about what about this site, what about that site, behind the scenes, and then they might come forward as planning applications. We know from what's been suggested to us and just from a look at easily available options that we're not going to meet that gap in Chepstow and Sevenside just within that area. So if members decide at council that we do give some weight to our housing land shortfall, and the starting point is a focus on Chepstow and Sevenside, the next decision is, do you stop there, knowing that's where the shortfall is, but knowing that we can't get anywhere near the amount of housing that we need to match the shortfall, or do we then go further? If the decision is then that we go further, you could either do that based on the LDP strategy, so you go straight to the top of the hierarchy, the main towns of Abergavenny and Monmouth, and then Sevenside's already in the mix, so then after that you're looking at the rural secondary settlements, or you do it from the south going upwards geographically, because the greatest pressure and need is in the south, which I mean effectively you take in Raglan, Usk, Penpeth, Lenny before you start looking at Monmouth and Abergavenny, because they're geographically further away. So those are the general options, or option 4 is that we do a bit of a hybrid of all of those. Excuse me. The one thing I would say is that we will never, with the best will in the world, recoup that 961 dwellings in that short space of time. So I don't want you to go away thinking, if we go with option 4, it's entirely fixed. It won't be. But equally, if we decide to say that we don't give any weight to our housing land shortfall, we know for definite we will have 961 dwellings down, and we'll be starting the next LDP, with that shortfall, and playing catch up instantly. So in an ideal world, we wouldn't have a shortfall and we'd have a plan-led system. Everyone would know where they're going. The LDP would be king. This is very much a suggestion of a pragmatic approach to how we deal with the problem we're in at the moment. I'll finish off now with one slide, which sets out what we suggest or recommend as ground rules. So I did mention that it isn't about anything anywhere, and that is certainly still the case. But if we are looking at approving unallocated sites, these are the suggested ground rules that we think should apply. So as basics, they have to comply with national planning policy on flood risk. So if it's in an undefended floodplain, national policy says no to residential developments. If it's on a defended floodplain but is a greenfield site, so never been built on before, again, national policy says no. I suggest we stick very firmly to that. That complies with the LDP policy as well. One area that is up for debate, arguably, is around other allocations, so employment sites and green wedges. Green wedges are an allocation that we've created in our LDP, and the purpose of those is to prevent two settlements coalescing, so to keep a gap, for example, between Chepstow and Portmerrick is one of them, between pretty much each of the settlements within Sevenside, so between Undy and Roggett, between Roggett and Caldicott, there's green wedges. So we could, if we wanted, say that they're up for grabs now as well. My recommendation to you is they are an LDP allocation, and the appropriate time to revisit that is via the next LDP rather than now. They do have a higher status of protection than simply being a site outside of the settlement boundary, which is the other unallocated sites we're looking at. So my advice to you is leave the green wedges alone. We'll review whether those allocations are correct or not via the next LDP process. Interestingly, that does rule out a fairly significant chunk of the southeast of the county. If you combine flood risk and green wedge, so that does prove part of the reason why we don't think Sevenside can do a vast amount to catch up. Employment allocations, again, we're suggesting they should be left alone. This shouldn't be an open invitation to turn all our employment allocations into housing sites, because this problem, we're talking now about housing, but our situation in Monmouthshire is about more than housing. There's no point in having a strong workforce in their 20s and 40s and then nowhere to put the jobs. So I think we should hold firm on the employment sites unless they can show they fully comply with policy E1 and there really is no realistic future demand for that site. So we're certainly not suggesting that those other areas should come up for grabs. The flip side to that argument is, just to be upfront and open with you, you could prevent development outside of settlement boundaries if you let employment allocations within settlement boundaries go for housing. So it is a balance, but then if we've got nowhere to put the jobs, which we need as well, and links into the point that's made earlier about out commuting, then we're causing different problems, I would suggest. Next ground rule is we should stick to the 35% affordable housing. That is cross-county, except the main village sites where it would be 60%. Excuse me. And we should have no negotiation over that. It's 35% or there's the door. And I really do think on these unallocated sites we can take that hard line and win the arguments. It's in there just as a very short sentence, but the same does apply. They must be acceptable in other planning terms. So this isn't about any old rubbish in any location causing any impacts. We do still retain that control. All of these applications, we'd have to advertise them as a departure application. They all come to planning committee automatically. And if they're of a particular size, then they can be called in by the Welsh Government as well. And then the last 2 points are linked. But we need to be clear, I think, that we're not just opening the floodgates to any quantity of anything. The scale of the additional development, we think, should be in the context of the LDP spatial strategy. So we shouldn't be having 500 houses in Raglan when it's further down on the hierarchy and is a smaller settlement. It needs to be sympathetic to that context. We're not just saying anything. And also, in the main villages, we are just talking about small 60% affordable housing sites where there isn't an allocated site. And in my advice, I'd go further and suggest some areas have already had a chunk. So, for example, Llanfoist, we've already approved 115 houses outside of the plan. I think for somewhere the size of Llanfoist, that's enough. Not forever. We'll look at it again in the next LDP. But I think there should sort of be a line drawn for Llanfoist outside of the next LDP, and we'll look at other areas. So that's what we're suggesting as a set of ground rules. So the officer recommendation ultimately is that we should give considerable weight still to our lack of housing land supply, which means we would be supporting unallocated sites subject to those ground rules and subject to them being acceptable in general planning terms. So if they're causing an air quality issue or a highway safety issue and it can't be addressed, then it isn't supported, isn't approved. But we do deviate away from an LDP plan-led system, which would be the ideal scenario, but we think is a pragmatic solution to tackling the problem. So as I mentioned, all of those applications, they come in, they have to be consulted on, so there's community engagement through that angle. They have to come to planning committee. That's set out in our scheme of delegation. And if they're over 150 dwellings or 6 hectares, then we have to notify the Welsh Government as well. So that, Chair, is essentially the options and the recommendation. So we're looking at, as officers, at this option 4, so a bit of a hybrid looking at the different options, but not immediately leaping to Abergavenny or Monmouth because of the hierarchy, looking at places like Raglan and Usk. In the back of this, we're mindful of what we know is in the background or even potentially achievable. So Usk, people have been asking around about sites, for example, but it is significantly constrained by flood risk areas. So the idea of them having anywhere near the 115 that Land Forest has had, I can't see that happening. So yeah, that's it in a nutshell. They're the options to be debated or talked through, or some of the implications of how that works. Hopefully that makes some sense, Chair.
Thank you, Mark. So we've got those scrutiny. Then we're being asked to scrutinise those two options, and obviously the shades of colour within option 2 is what Mark is talking about in terms of where we go. If we decide on a hybrid or another approach, but it's also important that we scrutinise the ground rules as well to make sure we're happy with that. And just to reiterate, as Mark has said, this is not carte blanche to allow any development, because the normal planning process terms will remain in place and will continue. So on that note, I'll open it up, and I've got Councillor Feakins first. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Mark. I'd very much go along with Officer's recommendation, in as much as I think it's still important for us to give considerable weight, because that gives us the freedom within the LDP process to look at and consider new sites as they come through. We said earlier in the meeting earlier that when they built the Tesco's down in Newport, that was all singing, all dancing. Things change very quickly, and I think this gives us that bit of flexibility to change our position without being so rigid. And also that that if it wasn't for this policy, then we wouldn't have delivered the 35% affordable housing in Rockfield Road, which is needed in Monmouth. And as much as I can see the arguments for saying that we need to or consider or give more weight maybe to areas in the south of the county, because that's where the higher need is, we need affordable housing all over the county. We need it in Abergavenny, in Monmouthshire. We're desperately short in Monmouth still now. So I would be minded not to go down the road of limiting our thoughts or limiting our procedures to only look at and only consider the places where we know there's a higher need. There's a need across the county in all respects. I think what is also important, and so that's very much my position on it. I think what's important with the ground rules is that it costs the same to build houses, whether it's next to a village or next to a main settlement. Going on what Ruth said earlier, and what I said earlier about the releasing of more land around villages and the higher number of building plots that come available on the market, the cheaper they become. We've discussed in planning the idea or the known case of having smaller development sites of 10, 3, 5, 15 houses, whatever it's going to be. That provides local work for local builders, local developers. The big developers are only looking at sites 80, 100, 150 houses. They won't touch nothing less than 50 because it's just not within their remit. So suddenly we've got that band of housing where we're not delivering maybe. I think the 60-40 policy is suited as well. For me, I think the ground rules of this, I think we should allow ourselves that freedom, that 35% freedom. If there are people that can bring land forward next to villages, again, obviously it's got to fit within the LDP context. But if there are people that are able to bring those forward, I think we should accept those within the 35% rule and move away from the 60% rule. And I think that may help us deliver local need, local housing to local villages, because we need affordable housing in local villages as much as we do in the towns.
Thank you very much. Do you want to come back on that?
Yeah, could I just come back on that one point? I completely agree with the sentiments of the last point around the main villages. And I think my advice and my view is that's something we look at in the next LDP. The risk of allowing 35% around main villages is we incentivise those people who have failed to bring forward their 60% affordable housing allocations. And those people that have brought forward their 60% allocations are almost worse off for doing the right thing. So I think that's the reason we've stuck to the 60%. I talk in there, slightly nebulously about main villages without an allocated site. That's only actually two of them. One is St Arvan's and one is Llandogo. The others all have an allocation. And again, we had a discussion around exactly the same issue you've raised, Councillor Feakins, as officers. Should we have more 60-40 sites in villages that have already developed theirs? Or what about those villages that haven't? So Little Mill, for example, that site's still sat there. Do we let someone else come in with a different site? We felt that the best approach to not undermine the current policy was to stick with that. But I take on board the points you're making, so I'd be interested to hear what other members say or feel. I think the wider concept is something we already are starting to review as to what we do in the next LDP. But that was a bit of the rationale behind it.
Okay. Yeah.
Just very, very quickly on that one point, and I think that you hit the nail on the head, really. It's understanding what the right thing is. Is the right thing to say 60-40 is the right thing, and we don't have all that many sites coming forward, or is the right thing to say, actually, let's free it up, let's have 35% coming forward and have more sites coming forward? Is that the right thing? And I think it's notwithstanding what you've said, obviously, but I think that it's considering what is the right thing. For me, it's about delivering more units onto the ground, more affordable units coming out because of that process. And that frees up, the supply and demand issues.
Sorry, just one point on that, just to help shape members' thinking as they go, because if that, gathers some traction, it's worth thinking about. So if we did go with that approach, I guess I would question what would we then do with the allocated 60% affordable housing sites in the LDP that haven't come forward yet? Would we accept 35% on those? In order to bring them forward, arguably. Because if we said no, it would seem a bit harsh that someone that's put their site in via the plan and been helpful is worse off than someone that's come forward now. So just throw that option in there for members to think through, to give that some thought.
Happy, Councillor Feakins? Yeah, is that okay?
Only that I'd say that if they haven't if they haven't come forward yet, then this does give an option to come forward, and where it's better to have 35% of something than 60% of nothing.
Okay, Councillor Becker.
I can actually get on board with a lot of what Matt's saying there. I mean, I think that 60% figure could sort of hamstring us a little bit. And, it's interesting. It says the scale of additional residential development will be considered in the context of the LDP spatial strategy. It's the scale and context of that sentence that I think we need to apply maybe to that, the 60% figure around the main villages, in the sense that, no, there isn't one size fits all. It depends what is in the LDP waiting to come forward. It depends what has already taken place there as construction. It may be that we say, look, we'd actually like to bring this site and the one in the LDP forward, so let's take it down to 40 or 50%. We need to have some kind of flexibility there, but I've got no problem at all with the 35% bottom line. I think that's absolutely spot on the money. And in terms of going back to the shades of grey, the 50 shades of grey of what we do about the tan advice, 50 shades of tan. There's one that says, tie it into the LDP, and we've seen how inflexible the LDP has been for us as a result of bridge tolls and Brexit and all sorts of things. How do you feel about if we took that option? Do we think that we would actually be tying ourselves up in knots a little bit? And equally for one of the other options, the hybrid option, maybe a bit more clarity on what the hybrid option entails, because the danger there for me, I think emotively I look at it and I think that sounds confusing to me, and so I mean a little bit more about how those two might work in terms of weighting. But I am certainly in favour of keeping the weighting. Let's just point that out.
Okay, thanks, Councillor Beckett. Do you want to clarify that, Mark?
Yeah, I shall endeavour to. So if we stuck with the strategy, then having looked at, well, you could either bypass the evidence that the greatest needs in the south and skip straight to the strategy, in which case your focus is on Chepstow, Abergavenny and Monmouth. No, luckily Chepstow's the shortfall as well in that sense, and then closely followed by Sevenside. So it does kind of balance out anyway. Or if you're looking at the evidence, then having ruled out or considered the extent to which you can do more in Chepstow and Sevenside and that housing market area, then you would leap to Abergavenny and Monmouth and kind of geographically skip the part in the middle to a greater or lesser extent. I think the downside of doing that is partly just around how the real world's working and the pressure is in the south, and also limiting our options. It's just trying to balance that really carefully with the rural secondary settlements. We've developed all these great names for things in the LDP, but they are smaller. Raglan is of its size. It does have amenities, but it is of its size. So we need to bear in mind how much can you reasonably put there before either physically it can't cope, or kind of socially and culturally it becomes dwarfed or too quickly developed. So it's trying to get that balance right, I think. So I think where the hybrid comes in is it just gives us those options with a bit of flexibility around both the rural secondary settlements and the main towns. The other bit I haven't particularly touched on in the presentation was in the report is, although Monmouth, actually behind the scenes, we're aware of quite a few theoretical options, Welsh Waters said there's an infrastructure capacity issue. So further development in Monmouth and Wisham would be objected to until upgrades are undertaken. So none of that's insurmountable. It's a normal part of the process, unfortunately, as Councillor Murphy referred to earlier. But the chances of it coming forward, getting consent, Welsh Water being upgraded and houses built by the end of 2021 are pretty slim. So they could be great sites, they could come forward and theoretically help, but I don't think they'd actually impact on that 961 within that short time period. So I think that's, again, where the hybrid comes in, because then, if we stick with the settlement hierarchy and go straight to main towns, then really we're just with Abergavenny, because Monmouth's ruled out for the Welsh Water reason. So it's trying to get that balance right, I think. I don't know if that's explained it very clearly. So I think the main towns, they are bigger. I know everyone talks about amenities or lack thereof in places like Chepstow, Abergavenny and Monmouth, but in our county context, they are most certainly the best we've got. We do have schools, we do have public transport, railway stations even in 2 of them, which is quite exciting in this county. So they are the most sustainable places to put the development. In principle, it's then finding the correct sites or the acceptable sites around there. Longer term, I'm taking the conversation off piece slightly, but the next LDP, we need to think really long and hard about if that kind of strategy is one we can keep on with. Can we keep putting housing estates on the edge of those places? There will come a point somewhere where you can't. How near in the future is that point? And then what other options do we look at? So we're talking around the current policy, what we do in this short-term gap rather than the very long-term. Does that explain the hybrid any more clearly, Councillor Becker?
I think it explains it to the extent that what you're saying is the flexibility that the hybrid offers is actually the answer to my worry about sticking it to the LDP precisely. So that sounds to me like that would be my preferred way of going forward, I think, to use that, because it gives us that flexibility. So.
While we're on a Chepstow councillor, Mark, can I just clarify the figures for Chepstow? Can you pull that slide up, please? Just in terms of the Chepstow sites that have been allocated, the Maybe Bridge site and Dendick sites are not there. Is there a reason? Is there a reason for that?
The Maybe Bridge site. What was the other one you mentioned? Sorry. And 7 Key. Okay, and 7 Key. They'll both be factored into. Well, 7 Key will partly factor into completions, because there's about 5 units fully completed. There's about 30 due to be finished imminently. The rest of that one will come in as large site windfall in effect of stuff coming forward. Maybe Bridge will be as an allocated site coming forward, but we know. With Maybe Bridge, for example, there's a good 12 months before a house will be finished on the site, because they've got a remediation project to go through next anyway. So although it's got outline consent for up to 350 dwellings, up to 450, sorry, I think, up to 450, and it's allocated in the LDP for 350, so the 350 is factored in the LDP target. It's not going to get anywhere near that within the plan period. That is an important point, though, going off on a slight tangent. Our sites are coming forward. So we're not talking about we've got sites in the plan, we thought we're going to get 200 houses, we're going to get 0. We will get 200 houses, it's just later. So if we're talking about unallocated sites, if you pick Chepstow to continue the example, the end result will be new unallocated sites plus Maybe Bridge. Because Maybe Bridge will happen just slower than we hoped. So we're very mindful in this recommendation. We're talking about an additional number of houses, not an instead of. So I think members just need to be clear on that as well. But obviously, again, it feeds into the next LDP. There will be some level of more growth in the next LDP. We're not going for zero. How much is yet to be decided and where. But again, this will continue feeding into that plan. So some of Maybe Bridge is factored into the allocated site projections, but not all of it because of the timescales.
That's great, thank you. Councillor Harris.
Thank you, Chair. Basically, I go along with all the ground rules that you've mentioned there, Mark. We've got our own built-in flexibility if we adopt them, as opposed to, if you like, before the Minister talked about TAN 6.2, we were almost in hock to, because of the 5-year land supply that we didn't have, almost in hock to any developer saying, I want it here, I want it now, sort of thing. Now we've got a situation where the at least 2 of the developments that come through on the basis of unallocated sites have given us clearly 35% affordable housing. And as we said time and time again, that is absolutely vital. There's no arguments there. There's no district valuer coming in with the developers saying, oh, we can't afford this and we can't afford that. We overcome that problem straight away. And maybe it's worth looking at the 60% sites. As you say, some have come through and some are in the pipeline. The thought of not having those sites developed and losing the 60%, or being more flexible down the line and saying, all right, we'll allow 35%, should be explored a bit more, I think. And if it's possible to, I don't know if we can give new ground rules, new timelines. Maybe we should find out how seriously developers consider the ones in the pipeline that haven't been built on yet. What are they really interested, or is it something that they're just toying around with? But anyway, as I say, having been on the planning committee 14 years now, adopting the ground rules as mentioned gives us a lot more flexibility within the county, and I think that's got to be a good thing.
Okay. Do you want to say anything on that, or do you want me to take some more questions, or do you want to come back?
Could I just mention, Chair, about the 60-40 sites, just to go back with a bit of background? Just so members are clear, the whole intention of those was to deliver affordable housing in and around our main villages, where it otherwise wouldn't happen. So our policy already allows for, and would continue to allow for, what we call rural exception sites. So around the main village, anyone could come forward now and offer to build 100% affordable. And in principle, we would agree that. That's national planning policy, and our local policy supports that. But we recognise that 100% affordable housing is pretty unlikely to happen. Hence, we went to 60%. So allowing some market housing to help supplement it. So that was a concept behind it. It was set out as different to the normal housing sites. So I think Councillor Harris is right. We need to explore a bit more how we could look at those 60% affordable housing sites. And so I'm certainly happy to go away and give that some more thought. But yeah, it's just again to bear that in the back of your minds as to what the intention was in the first place. Certainly the concept of looking at how we deliver housing at an appropriate small scale in the villages and deliver affordable housing for local people is something we definitely need to look at in the next LDP. What we do in this gap, I think, needs a bit more explanation.
Okay, thanks, Mark. Councillor Watkins.
Thank you. So, a few questions, if I may. First of all, the suspension of 6.2. it's stated as being a suspension rather than as a permanent state of affairs. Do we have any ideas how long it's going to last? What was the point of Welsh Government actually deciding to make this decision? Because it's having a big impact on us, and so it'd be really useful to have a bit more background information as to what's going on at Welsh Government level from that one. Secondly, you've mentioned 2 unallocated sites that are in the pipeline, one of which is in my ward, and I'm very much aware of it. Are there any more that you've kind of had feelers put out for? So how many houses are we actually talking about in terms of changing our planning policy, changing our approach? And then a little voice for the residents who are next to these unallocated sites. If we decide to go away from the LDP, then those residents who bought their homes, not expecting there to be a housing development put right next to them, because in their solicitors' packs and everything that they will have had about purchasing those homes, it will not have stated that that land behind their houses is likely to be built on. So we'll have bought it thinking it's going to be one way. So we'll be changing the tack for those residents. So I think it's just important that we do bear in mind that we will be making a difference for those residents as well. And then the last point on the 60% affordable for the villages, I have a strong feeling that if we change that policy and we allow developers to build less than 60%, we will never get them back in the future on a future plan to building 60% again, because they'll all think, oh, we don't have to do that now. We'll wait till the next time. They're bound to drop it off for us again. So I would really urge caution before we start dropping down those 60% around those particular small settlements. We desperately need those affordable houses amongst the small villages. And we really do need to make sure that developers don't think they can get away with doing what the heck they like. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, I think the last one was more not something I needed to answer, but I understand exactly what you're saying. The other 2, very questions. In terms of why it's suspended, it's set out, as much as we know, is what's set out in the letter that was circulated to you. So the Cabinet Secretary recognises a lot of pressure on local planning authorities and communities from speculative development, unallocated sites. It is an issue that's increasingly facing us, but it's a really significant issue in some places like Caerphilly, where they've got something like a 1.3-year housing land supply. And again, without going into too much detail, they started work on a new LDP. It wasn't accepted politically, but they're almost having that plan implemented by default, because they've got sites that they've publicly said they as officers think are acceptable, got to a certain stage, plan revoked, developers are coming, they haven't got a land supply, so those sites are going through. So it's become a very politically contentious issue in some areas. Things are cracking on without them, albeit it's within their gift to do a new LDP. So that's one angle. The Cabinet Secretary is certainly mindful of it removing, in effect, the plan-led system, which is what we're meant to have. So that's certainly clear in her letter. But I guess I've touched on that, and it's all well and good. And as a planner, that's our idea of utopia. It's all plan-led, and we're in control, and isn't it great? But I think in trying to get a pragmatic outcome approach, I think we have to accept the current plan hasn't delivered what we thought it would and when we thought it would. We're not saying it's failed. We're not saying it's thoroughly flawed. It just hasn't done what we needed it to do when we needed it to do it. And we do think that we need to tackle those issues, mindful of not just the residents who are perhaps mortgage-free and have a nice view of the mountains, but their kids or grandkids who need to have a house in the county or would like to. So it's trying to factor all of that in. So that's in terms of why it's suspended. How long? You're quite right. It's suspended, not deleted. But we just don't know. It was initially said it was while we consider evidence around why housing sites and affordable housing is not coming forward, and the role of planning in delivering housing. That was due to be a consultation over the summer, and there is one which closes mid-October. But I mentioned earlier some previous research into housing sites not coming forward, and this Arcadis report, that was about 18 months ago. So we've got the report from this consultant called Arcadis. They've set out a different approach to doing LDPs and having more evidence up front, but none of that's actually made its way into policy yet. So one option, well, in terms of the do nothing option, part of that could be sit and wait, see what the Welsh Government does. But I don't think it's going to be a quick resolution. I don't think they'd leave the policy unchanged. I think they'd do something to it. So quite what that looks like and when it happens, I'm afraid I don't know. And I don't personally think it's going to be quick, given that we're 18 months down the line on the other bits, and we know what they want, but it hasn't quite happened in a policy way that we can back up yet. Which is why, you know, if I thought it was going to be 2 months, I'd say, all right, sit tight, see what they do. It's why I'm recommending that we do something ourselves. And she's very clearly in her letter said it's down to us as decision maker now to decide what weight, which suggests again to me it's a longer term gap, rather than, you know, wait 2 months and see what comes. Excuse me. Your point about residents' communities is absolutely right. People have certain views of what might or might not happen around them. Interestingly, without being too dull on the detail, when you buy a house, the search you pay for is just the land you're buying, unless you've explicitly asked them to look around the property. Most people don't, from our experience. But even if they had, I would say that what they've been looking at is the current LDP. We've started work on a new LDP anyway, so you know, just because someone's fortunate enough to have nice fields behind them now doesn't mean it'll be that way forever, whether that's the next LDP or the one beyond. Who knows? But yeah, I mean, people do have certain expectations now of what they live in, what they've bought, and an idea what might or might not change around them. So this does go away from that. We have to be mindful of that. They would be engaged, albeit it is via the planning application process, which is later than if it were through the new LDP. So that is something that members should factor in. I guess it does come back to the ideal approach is stick with your LDP, wait until we've done the new one. Everyone's engaged through that process. But the massive downside of that is that's 3 and a bit years away. Can we wait that long? Are we prepared to wait that long? I would suggest that it wouldn't be the right thing to do in outcome terms. But that's what's before members for September.
Okay, you happy with that, Councillor Watkins? So we've got Councillor Powell and Councillor Brown. Councillor Powell.
Thank you, Chairman. I've been approached lately by a couple of different people about the proposed planning up the top side of Cantref Ward. I don't, you know, what state is that? Is that going to come into the next LDP or what's happening over that?
Chair, I need to avoid talking about site specifics, I think. Because really we need to talk about the strategy anyway.
Yeah.
But part of the question I didn't answer from Councillor Watkins was around, you know, how much do we know about how much might come forward. We do have people come to us asking us for advice or suggesting sites either for the next LDP or the gap. Obviously, questions about sites during the 5-year housing land supply gap have ended at the moment because everyone's mindful of this and waiting to see what happens. I think ultimately, though, I mean, if you just created a rule today that said, you know, forget the LDP, come in with some housing sites, you know, we'd have tens of thousands of them. People would be coming at us. But that doesn't mean that we agree tens of thousands, because it was in our gift as a planning authority, planning committee's gift, to say what works where, what's acceptable. There's only so much infrastructure capacity before things topple over anyway. So I haven't got a number I can give you of how many units are sat there waiting in the wings, because the question really is what would come forward and how many of those are acceptable, and that's what comes before you in due course as members.
In the next LDP.
No, I think if we need to be clear as members. If council decides we will give considerable weight to our lack of 5-year housing land supply, we will have more planning applications for development on unallocated sites. That, you know, that will undoubtedly happen. That doesn't mean that they're all acceptable, or the planning committee will agree them all. You know, whether because of the site specifics or just the overall volume is too much. If we said we're not going to give any weight to our 5-year housing land supply, I imagine all of those same sites will come in via the next LDP process and ask to be considered. And ultimately, the answer should be the same. If they're acceptable to be allocated in the next LDP, then we'd be looking at them favourably in the short term and vice versa, if that makes sense. So the end result shouldn't be any different. You know, we should be sat there in 2023 looking at a scenario that looks the same. You know, but they've either come in before the LDP or through the LDP, I guess.
Well, you know, it's like they all panic, don't they? You know, where they're living, and somebody's just moving to that area, and they said, you know. But it's like you say, you only have the ground around you. What goes on beyond is in the future. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Councillor Brown.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Chair. I've got quite a number of points. I don't know whether I'll be allowed to come in later if I don't manage to deal with them all. I mean, basically, we're looking at the situation about whether we decide that no weight should be given to the lack of a 5-year supply, or some weight or considerable weight. Now, I think that there is another option that's being presented that isn't necessarily put in the report, which I think is, I think we should be arguing that no weight should be given to the lack of 5-year supply, and only some weight if there are various things that are met, because I don't think this hybrid thing is terribly clear. Now, if we do that, so in other words, we've got no weight should be given to the lack of 5-year supply, full stop. However, and then we say that some weight, I'm not saying considerable weight, is given to things like, for example, that the site ensures that there's an improvement in air quality and not detrimental to it, that the existing road structure and infrastructure can cope, roads, health service, education services, community services, our housing need for affordable housing and 1- and 2-bedroom properties to increase our younger population and accommodation for elderly, downsizing are being adequately met, to ensure sustainable plan-led development, taking account of environmental and social aspects of development, and not developer-led development. Now, the advantages of that type of approach, which I think, since we can determine what weight is given, because that's down to the discretion of the local authority, is it then gives us the option to actually say, when we have a development which is totally unsuitable, no, our starting point is no weight to be given to the lack of 5-year supply, and therefore we follow the current LDP. However, and by doing that, we are more plan-led than developer-led. However, if we have this caveat with the ground rules, and I'm concerned about what exactly the ground rules are, because the slide that was put up wasn't the same as what was in the report in relation to the ground rules, and we've got to be categorically clear, because all those things that were listed there weren't there. The other concern I've got is in relation to the evidence base, because it's already been pointed out that in relation to Chepstow, I mean, we've heard in the planning committee that you know, reserve matters are being looked at and that site is coming forward. Now, that makes a significant difference to the figures, and then we're saying, oh, we concentrate on Chepstow and Seven Sides. So I think the basis of the foundation of that argument is incorrect. My concern about the Chepstow area, and I actually went to a cluster meeting with community councillors in Chepstow and surrounding areas, including across the border in Gloucestershire. And the unanimous opinion was a concern about infrastructure, traffic congestion with more housing on both sides of the border, and resulting in more air quality pollution, not only in Chepstow, Monmouthshire, but also its impact for traffic queues for commuters from the Lydney, Gloucestershire side as well. We're expecting a 20%, up to 20% increase in traffic with the tolls going, and the LDP tends to concentrate on development within the Welsh area and not its impact between England and Wales as well, which does have an impact for the main towns. So I don't think the strategy on the last bullet point is quite right, because I think we need to have development across the county, because people do commute long distances, you know, from Abergavenny to for example, to Cardiff and also to Bristol. And sometimes if the traffic congestion is going to get so bad in our area, they may be quicker to do that. So I don't think that we've covered all the bases here, and we've considered all the factors. With regard to the 60% development, which relates to a main village, I think I would agree with the point that that's what's within the current plan. And really, when we're looking about the weight that we put on the lack of 5-year supply, then really that's to do with this interim period. And if we change it for in the interim period for unallocated sites, then, you know, the ones that are allocated within the LDP will think, oh, well, you know, that would be an unfair situation. I agree that possibly for the next LDP we might look at that maybe more towards, say, 50%. I wouldn't agree with 35%, because I think basically villages are villages. You're not supposed to have urban sprawl on the planning side. So I'm not happy with the approach that we're currently taking. And I also think that in relation to the 5-year supply, we're actually quite, when you see the table that looks at, and I've looked at tables to do with our supply in comparison with others in Wales, and actually 3.9 isn't too bad. And the reason why we're in this position, and why the minister, I suppose, had to suspend this requirement, was because the criteria on how we worked out whether we got a 5-year supply or not was changed, and we would have met it anyway. But I think that's the wrong approach, and I'm very much in favour of the approach we've taken in social services, which is the idea of turning the world upside down, which is basically not saying that we should be developer-led, but we should be plan-led. And I think if we're very careful about the way that we word our weighting about the lack of 5-year supply, we can actually do that, because if we have developments we don't like, and it also increases our bargaining power in relation to affordable housing, in relation to unallocated sites. So I think there's a different approach that we can take here, but there's also different developments. I think that what was said previously, I think by Councillor Becker, about community-led trusts is one idea, but also there's other ideas that are in other areas. For example, there is what's a site called Tadpole Village, which is near Swindon, and this has got this idea of a more altruistic looking at healthy living and a community type of structure. I mean, it's got a thing about being in harmony in terms of lifestyle. It's got healthy living, travel choices, infrastructure, quality design. It says also here about street scene, well-connected, civic pride and so forth, technology. And it's actually, it's a particular developer that leads it. And then there's actually other developers who go in line with it. So I think there's other innovative things that we need to look at to be sustainable. Looking at that, I mean, it also provides things like the schools and the community centres and so forth. But I mean, the only thing I would add on that, I would like to see more solar panels and also electric charging points being part of our plan to make sure that we try and reduce air pollution and look at this in different ways. But I do think that we need to turn this on its head, because there's far too much concentration on on housing and the lack of supply, as opposed to thinking, what do we need? And we need to be in the driving seat. And I think more of the same won't do, because we're going to end up with 4 and 5 bedroom houses, because they're the most profitable ones for the builders to build.
Thank you, Councillor Brown. An array of very good and very interesting points. Do you want to pick up some of them, Mark?
Yeah, there's a couple I pick up on. Primarily, I think the suggestion was that members are being told the maybe bridge is coming forward, which means these figures are out of date or wrong. They're not. Maybe bridge is factored into this. So this takes account of everything that we know is happening, has consent or is in the LDP. So maybe bridge hasn't changed anything in terms of Chepstow, or and the same's true in the other areas. You will have sites in your wards and know what's happening with those. So the same's true. I completely agree about the opportunities for doing things differently with different models. But I think that's something that we need to approach via the next LDP, or just generally. This conversation's around having sites to build housing of whatever model. So if we say that we're not going to give any weight to our lack of housing and supply, then there is nowhere for any of those models to happen. So it's... Yeah, well, I was a bit confused by the suggestion that we have no weight unless they meet criteria, in which case they have some weight. Because that's, I think, ultimately what we're proposing. Albeit that we're saying, I'm using the word considerable, but members might think it should be less than considerable, and so some weight. But weight is given to the lack of 5-year land supply, and the ground rules that I've put in there are trying to capture, I think, many of the things that you were talking about, Councillor Brown. You did talk about some extra issues. In terms of the ground rules, to briefly explain why they're different to the reports, because of reporting deadlines, I've already had to draft the council report, which is sat on my desktop behind the scenes, waiting to see what happens today and what I need to add to it, and any other points I need to clarify. But in the council report, I've expanded upon the ground rules, because more things have come up from discussions with my colleagues and team. And then what's on that slide is an abbreviated version of them, just to make it broadly make sense on a PowerPoint slide. So getting the first point down to a few words rather than the big sentence. So that's why there is a slight difference. If there's other ground rules you think should be included, then by means say. But I would say, I think, albeit it's only 5 or 6 words, 7 words. 7 words. The one about it being must be acceptable in other planning terms captures, many of those things that Councillor Brown mentioned in terms of quality design, congestion, infrastructure, air quality. That is captured within that sentence. So I think we're actually aiming for the same thing, but perhaps expressing it in a slightly different way, albeit that Councillor Brown's sort of starting point was around the plan-led system. I'm not going to try and mislead you. This deviates from the plan-led system. It is what it is. It's whether you think that's justified to achieve an outcome, or if you think we're better off waiting until the next LDP and sticking with the plan-led system.
Okay, Councillor Brown, very briefly, because I've got other speakers.
Because we've been given the scope to say what weight we can give to our lack of 5-year supply. I don't see why we can't actually just really to give us the freedom to actually reject sites that we don't actually want, because basically that was the idea, that we didn't want speculative development and it should be plan-led, and this is why the Minister suspended this requirement. So I don't see why we can't have basically almost a hybrid thing, that we're saying, in the first instance, the first priority is to say that no weight shall be given, but some weight. So in other words, that's the first option, so that we put ourselves in a much better bargaining position in relation to unallocated sites and what we actually want from them, because we're saying, well, our first option is that. However, if you meet all of these different ground rules, we will give some weight to the fact, because on the other hand, if we just say some weight, then we have got the ground rules, but we haven't got that extra negotiating point that we could have had otherwise.
Okay. There's at least another 3 speakers, so I will move on. Councillor Edwards and then Councillor Strong.
Right, thank you. I know the clock is ticking if you look at the back, and I know we're supposed to be having a lunch buffet. I expect they're all waiting, champing at the bit. Of course, land is the word that we've been using a great deal now this morning. But there's one thing that does bother me when we are constantly talking of housing, the number of people, school places, so on and so on. But I hope in the next LDP we do think of where we end up, and that is cemeteries. We never seem to be thinking with all this housing, because we did about 10 years ago, we did a big survey about a cemetery. It cost the authority a lot of money and it never happened. But we keep on having people are born, but also people die. And I think we should be considering in our LDP about cemeteries, because you can't have them just anywhere. I mean, you can't just bury an animal just anywhere. I mean, I know that from farming, and we had all the foot and mouth and all that criteria that went on, which was a terrible nightmare for everybody. But I think we should be considering, with these larger towns and settlements and whatever, what happens at the end of our day, because none of us will be here forever. So that's another spanner in the works for them to think about. Thank you. Thank you for indulging me on that. Thank you.
No, that's okay. And I'm sure the derogation on fallen stock will be changed when we leave the European Union. Mark, are you happy for me to take another? Yeah. Councillor Strong, then, please.
Thank you, Chairman. It was just a quick one, Mark. You did mention Usk in your introduction, that because of the flood problems in Usk, we're a little bit limited with further development. I'm in favour of extra development. We want to keep the youngsters in Usk if we possibly can. Obviously, there's not a great choice of where the houses can be placed. All I'd ask is that it's done sympathetically, and you do take a great deal of trouble in making sure that that's the case. Thank you.
Yeah, Chair. I guess just to reiterate that these all have to come in as planning applications, and they all automatically come to planning committee. So we have got those usual safeguards around the detail of design. But I guess that factor remains anyway. You know, we could do all of this. We could say no wait to housing land supply, wait for the next LDP, allocate a field somewhere in Usk. So that same consideration of design has to come in then. So that side of the process is all the same. But give you reassurance that, you know, we'll certainly do that.
Okay, Councillor Feakins.
Thank you, Chair, for indulging me. And just very quickly to pick up on the point regarding the 60%, the 60-40 split. When we develop properties and it goes off to the DVS for the DVS to work out the viability, the reason he comes back and tells us that the viability will only allow 18% or 22% or whatever that figure is, commuted sum or affordable housing provision, is that that's all the profit there is in the scheme. When we look at 60-40 splits on the edge of villages, we're relying on the benefactors of the local land to give us the land, or effectively give that land at subsidised costs in order for those sites to come forward. And that's predominantly why those sites don't come forward, is because the landowners effectively having to give that land away for nothing. And my thinking and reasoning for the 35% is that 35% has proven to be affordable, although I would say that takes it right up to the very edge of viability on that 30, on whether it is or isn't viable. And at 60%, if we've got land allocated at 60-40 splits, why aren't our housing association, registered RSLs, taking that land forward? And again, I would bring it back to viability, that they're not viable. Or that the landowners aren't willing to bring that land forward and give it away for free. And so I think although it's admirable to try and get to that 60%, I think the practicality and the realism of it is that it wouldn't bring land forward.
Okay. Do you want to come back on that, Mike?
Yeah, extremely briefly, just on that one point. I think the issue where 60/40 sites haven't come forward is around the landowner's aspirations. We're not asking that the land comes forward for free, but we're certainly expecting it will come forward for less than they're after. The challenge is, as soon as they think it's a residential allocation of sorts, they imagine full-blown resi value, and it hasn't got that because it's 60%. But the underlying issues are the same. I guess my parting thought on it was I would share the concerns expressed by Councillor Watkins and Councillor Brown about if we backpedal on the 60% policy now in the interim, we risk never recapturing it. I'm not saying it's definitely going to be in the next LDP. That's something that will come before you in due course. It certainly needs looking at to see how it has worked and hasn't worked. But I think we might risk losing it entirely if we're not careful.
Okay, Councillor Blackburn.
Thanks, Chair. Yeah, when I was reading it, I mean, I was sort of, my first filtering system was looking at, do we stick to the plan? I'm usually liking to stick to the plan because communities know what's going to happen. They're not going to be nervous. There's not going to be any surprises. And then we review it in order to develop the next plan. But then looking at should we do something, I was starting to think, actually, this is more than just houses, more than just bricks and mortar. These are homes, these are people's lives, and that's the element we have to look at. Always nervous about sort of change in tack, but I guess when you're looking at the safety net, that is that we have got existing planning legislation that we have to abide by. We will have these ground rules or strict criteria that we have to abide by. Just for clarification, and I might have missed it when you did your introduction, so I know you've got your pre-planning, so that's a good filter system. Then it comes through planning, we've got the criteria. What if at the end of that, Monmouthshire say, no, it's not appropriate, and then the developers are in the system now and can appeal to Welsh Government? Could they overthrow that and say, no, go ahead, even though we've gone through the system going, it's not a great development?
Yeah, they could, Councillor Vapor. So if anyone who's applied for planning permission had it refused has a right of appeal. So that would apply. So the inspector then who looks at it would take into account our conclusions and why we've said no. But also they then become, just to complicate things slightly, they become the decision maker. So they're the ones then deciding what weight to give our 5-year housing land supply. So theoretically they could come to a different conclusion, but if we've got a clear evidence-based policy approach, then we like to think they would stick with it. But yeah, I guess the proof will be in the pudding.
Okay. Councillor Devi.
Thank you, Chair. I was listening to everybody talking about what's going on in our county, in the county, and what we can do with it in the county to address a lot of the issues. The problem is for us in Chepstow, of course, is most of the development that's going on at any speed is just across the road. And that is impacting on us immensely. We've got to look at what's happening now, and also what's going to happen in the future if the camp takes off. It's interesting. I went to an Economic and Transport Committee meeting with the Forester Dean Council last week, and they are now plotting out. They've got a huge map, and they are plotting out all their settlements and all the ones that have industry in them, so that they have an idea of where they're going to put their resources, where they're going to put their investment, and all these sort of issues. So they are well down the road in terms of transport and resources and getting the housing right and business in their county. and we're going to be the recipient of all that when that gets going. So what worries me is how fast are we going to make the strides necessary to see that we protect the businesses and the environment and everything else for our own citizens. I think the points made by Louise were very well made ones. The model she showed on the screen, which showed the settlements, and it has a business and everything else in. It's a city development model which started off in the States about 30 years ago, and that is how they grow them. And I know in Gloucestershire they're starting to develop that, and we ought to think about that. And the reason I say we ought to think about that is that in this committee, the meeting before last, we all decided that the issue with regard to the population in Monmouthshire, the transport in Monmouthshire, was really too big to tinker around it, if you like. And tinker is the wrong word, but you know what I mean. Try and adjust it with what we've got. And we all agreed that the answer must be a new settlement within Monmouthshire to deal with the problems that we have. And that, of course, should have take account of some commerce in it. It should have some education in it, and all those sort of things. And so I actually think we ought to be looking really farther ahead to solve some of these issues, because we're always playing catch up, and the people that are affecting us in our area of Wales are across the border, and we can't do anything about it.
Okay. Do you want to briefly come back on that?
Yeah, only briefly, Chair. Just say completely agree with the points around the need to think longer term, but that is what the new LDP will do. That's where all of that discussion comes in. So yeah, if we have lunch and then reconvene and we'll knock up a new LDP, that'd be great.
Just briefly, Mark, in terms of air quality and cumulative impact of potentially unallocated sites, would that already be factored into the ground rules and into the normal planning process? Would that need to be caveated in those bullets?
It would already be captured in the acceptable in other planning terms. That is a factor that we'd already look at. Apologies, Chair, but Paul White from Environmental Health will come along, especially to talk through how we'd look at that side of things. But he had to leave early for another meeting.
I did briefly speak to Paul before he left.
Yeah, so that is what we just look at as a normal planning consideration. So yeah, highways capacity, school infrastructure, air quality, all of that stuff will all be factored in. A lot of that's fairly easy to deal with. School infrastructure, for example, by extending the school, air quality is harder. So we'd factor in what's happening over the border as well.
Okay, I think everyone has had their say. I'm going to look to sum up now. It's clear from our current plan, and I think Mark touched on it at the very beginning. The current plan hasn't delivered what we thought and what we hoped it was going to do in terms of housing. But the question is, do we stick to the plan? And I think there was some feeling in the room, Councillor Brown particularly, felt that we should be sticking to the plan, but there could be some flexibility and some caveats in that. But also, I'm conscious of the discussion this morning, and some other councillors brought that through to this afternoon's session, was that there is a need for affordable housing, and there's a need now, and it's not just in the south of the county, but it's across the county. And can we afford, as in a local authority, to take forward such a shortfall of housing to the next LDP without trying to do something in the interim? And I'm getting the feeling that something needs to be done. So we looked at smaller development sites, and Councillor Feekins was, I think, quite right about that, looking at new parcels of land, looking for smaller developers to help us find solutions. Challenge the 60-40 concept, the affordability factor, and again, I think that's probably something that we shouldn't be looking to tinker with now, but more substantially with the LDP review. The Councillor Watkins talked about the rationale behind suspension of TAM 1 and the continuation period, and I think it is in sort of limbo, really. It could be reinstated, and that, there's obviously something that we'll have to take into account. But also we can't have this hiatus either, so we need to act. I think she brought forward a really poignant point about residents, those unaware of unallocated sites and what their impact would be. So we need to be mindful, certainly, of them. And we also talked about challenges of infrastructure, particularly in the southeast, in terms of being impacted by the Forest of Dean and Gloucestershire. There's also practical infrastructure implications, and I think Councillor Edwards touched on that with cemeteries, something that we don't always think about. I don't know where we'll be in the future. I hope my remains will generate some energy for someone somewhere down the line, so I'll be more practically useful perhaps than when I was living, but there we are. So in terms of trying to come to a conclusion, and the recommendation from officers is that we look at option 2E, which is a hybrid model. What is the feeling amongst the room? Do we agree with that? And also, do we agree with the current ground rules? I mean, this is just comments and observations today. This will go before full council in 2 weeks' time. So again, councillors will have a say then. Councillor Brown.
Yeah, thank you. I think it would be very helpful if, obviously there's the list of the ground rules, basically that are put up there in the bullet points, but there are also other things that are mentioned in ground rules in 4.4, which haven't been included in that slide, and it just says must be acceptable in other planning terms. Now, 4.4 says the development must be acceptable in other planning terms, and then it goes on to say if infrastructure is inadequate, etc., such matters as highway capacity, school capacity, primary healthcare, and air quality. Because I think in fact, obviously we have got infrastructure issues, and building more and more in areas which already can't cope infrastructure-wise, even primary healthcare where GP surgeries can't cope and things like that, is not going to solve the sort of issues that we've got, But I still also I'd be interested, I don't know, I think our new borough solicitor here, whether or not the idea, is he not?
He was. He's
gone, but I'd be interested in knowing whether this idea, and again this would help us in terms of appeals, because if we have this idea of basically, because we can say what we want in terms of the weight, if we did have this idea that effectively that no weight could be given, however, some weight could be given, I think that would help us in appeals if we have sites that we don't like, because our first point would be that, and it would help us with the negotiation. And I'd be interested to see what the our borough solicitor thinks about that particular idea, whether it's possible, because we tend to think of it in terms of having a sort of continuum between no weight, some weight and considerable weight, as if that's the only way we can actually state things. But I think the minister's letter actually gave us freedom to actually, say what we want. Okay, thanks.
No.
I think that's a no from Councillor Brown.
Yeah, I think that is a no. Is that something you could explore with Head of Legal between now and full council, Mark?
Yeah, I can. My reservation is I'm slightly confused about what it would mean. If you were somebody out there looking at potentially investing money to put a site forward, I wouldn't have any clarity on whether it was a maybe or a definitely not. I think the way I've proposed I don't think we're a million miles apart in terms of the end result. I think it's the way it's worded. So instead of a no, but maybe if you do this, I'm saying yes, subject to. And I think the end result is the same. The one thing I am very clear on is that this wording up here is just a PowerPoint abbreviation of all the words in paragraph 4.4. So I'm not suggesting we ditch any of what's written in that report. It is that whole shebang. But I'll happily speak to Matt Phillips about it and get his advice ready for the council report.
Can we be consulted on the ground rules before we get the council report, please?
I don't think we're going to have time for that. You'll have an opportunity at full council to make your concerns or make observations, I think. Councillor Harris.
Thank you, Chair. Basically to say, please can we vote, as you say, it's going to come to full council. So I'm happy to vote for 2E.
You're a seconder for 2E? Yeah. Okay. All those in favour for 2E then, raise their hands. Yeah. Okay. Those who are not in favour, 2. Right, okay. Have you got that, Richard? Yeah. Okay, thank you all very much. Thank you for your contributions this morning and this afternoon. Really important starting points, really, for that full review. We need to try and find a consensual way forward in developing the LDP review, so that when it comes to the final site allocation, there's no NIMBYism, or we're looking for the good of the county. So thank you ever so much. Lunch is provided outside, and have a good rest of the day and weekend. Thank you.